In the quiet forests outside Seattle, a man lived an ordinary life. He went to work, attended church, paid his bills, and blended into his neighborhood, while secretly hunting along a lonely highway, strangling dozens of young women, hiding their bodies near a slow-moving river, and watching police search for a killer they had already interviewed. A story of invisibility, broken systems, forgotten victims, and a monster who almost got away, until science finally forced the truth into the light. Thank you for being here for this important and difficult story. These moments aren't easy to hear, but understanding them helps us honor the voices that were lost and stay aware of the world around us. If this series brings you value, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps this channel grow. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The River That Whispered Secrets. In the early 1980s, just south of Seattle, the Green River moved slowly through dense patches of evergreen forest and quiet industrial land. It did not look ominous. It did not look like a place that would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in American history. The water flowed calmly beneath bridges, past gravel banks and tangles of brush, reflecting gray skies and drifting clouds. On most days, it felt like any other river in the Pacific Northwest, cool, steady, almost meditative in its rhythm. But in the summer of 1982, something changed. It began quietly. A body was found near the river's edge. Then another, and then another. At first, there was confusion. Authorities could not immediately see the full pattern forming. The victims were young women, many of them involved in street-based sex work, many living unstable lives, many struggling with addiction or homelessness. They existed on the edges of society, often overlooked, often unprotected. Their disappearances did not always trigger immediate alarm. In some cases, families had already endured long stretches without contact. The Green River began to give up its secrets slowly. By July of 1982, multiple remains had been discovered in or near the water. Detectives realized they were not looking at isolated crimes. They were looking at something coordinated, something systematic. The placement of the bodies suggested intention. The clustering suggested familiarity with the terrain. Whoever was responsible knew these wooded areas well. He understood how to hide in plain sight. The press soon began referring to the unknown perpetrator as the Green River Killer. Fear spread through King County. Women who worked along Pacific Highway South, a corridor known for truck stops, motels, and late-night traffic, began to feel the shift in atmosphere. The highway had always carried risk, but now there was something different. Something calculated. Police intensified patrols. Task forces were formed. Helicopters scanned wooded areas. Divers searched the riverbanks. Detectives interviewed pimps, motel clerks, regular clients, and other women working the same stretch of road. But the killer had already perfected a strategy that made him difficult to trace. He blended in. He was not a drifter passing through. He was not a visibly unstable man drawing attention. He was local. He was ordinary. He appeared, to most observers, completely unremarkable. The bodies continued to surface through 1982 and into 1983. Some were found tangled in brush far from the river itself. Others were discovered months later in remote wooded clusters. The terrain around the Green River became a silent archive of horror. Forensic technology at the time was limited. DNA profiling was not yet the powerful investigative tool it would later become. Detectives relied heavily on fiber analysis, witness statements, and pattern recognition. What they slowly began to understand was chilling. The killer targeted vulnerable women, often offering rides. He approached calmly, presenting himself as safe. Some witnesses later recalled a soft-spoken man driving a pickup truck. He did not threaten. He did not rush. He projected control. The interactions were transactional at first, familiar, routine. And then, at some point, something shifted. Most victims were strangled. There was rarely evidence of prolonged struggle. That detail alone disturbed investigators deeply. It suggested the killer acted suddenly, decisively, with practiced efficiency. He did not improvise in panic. He executed. Even more unsettling was the method of disposal. Bodies were sometimes placed in clusters, as though the killer revisited sites. Investigators theorized he may have returned to the scenes. Some profilers speculated he felt a sense of ownership over these hidden outdoor graveyards. The forest was not just concealment. It may have been ritual. By late 1983, the case had grown into one of the largest serial murder investigations in United States history. The Green River Task Force included dozens of detectives. Thousands of tips flooded in. Over 10,000 potential suspects would eventually be interviewed over the years. Polygraph tests were administered widely. Yet the killer remained undetected. The scale of the investigation was enormous. And yet, the fear was even larger. News reports warned women to avoid getting into cars alone. Community meetings were held. Advocacy groups pushed for greater protection for sex workers. But the social stigma surrounding the victims created a painful reality. Not everyone viewed the crisis with equal urgency. That tension would haunt the case for decades. Meanwhile, the river flowed on. It carried debris, fallen leaves, and sometimes the evidence of violence. The Pacific Northwest landscape, usually associated with misty beauty and quiet serenity, now held an undercurrent of dread. Families waited for phone calls that did not come. Parents searched for daughters. Friends retraced last known movements. The absence of answers became its own kind of torment. Investigators attempted to build a psychological profile. The killer likely lived or worked nearby. He was probably familiar with the sex work community. He may have appeared socially functional, organized, possibly married, possibly employed in a steady job that allowed flexibility and knowledge of the area's geography. What they did not yet know was how close they had already come. In 1982, police had questioned a local truck painter named Gary Ridgway. He lived in the area. He drove a pickup truck. He had been reported by a sex worker who claimed he had tried to choke her during a violent encounter years earlier. Ridgway denied involvement. He passed a polygraph test. At the time, there was insufficient evidence to hold him. The investigation moved on. For years, the Green River Killer remained an unidentified presence, a shadow moving through forests, highways, and motel parking lots. The pattern of killings appeared to slow in the mid-1980s, though remains continued to be discovered long afterward. Some believed the killer had been imprisoned for another crime. Others feared he had relocated. The uncertainty deepened the anxiety. What made the case particularly chilling was the ordinariness of the suspected offender profile. This was not a flamboyant criminal leaving theatrical messages. There were no taunting letters to newspapers, no cryptic symbols, no dramatic confessions, just silence, and method. The early years of the Green River investigation were marked by frustration and scale. Detectives sifted through mountains of paperwork, evidence storage rooms filled with fibers, photographs, and personal effects. Each victim had a name, a story, a family. Yet the case numbers kept climbing. The river had become a symbol. It represented not only the location of discovery, but also the way the truth seemed submerged, just out of reach. Every time remains surfaced, it reopened wounds. It reignited headlines. It reminded the public that somewhere nearby, someone had committed these acts and continued to live unnoticed as the task force pressed forward. One haunting question lingered in every strategy meeting and every late-night review of files. Was the killer watching the investigation unfold? Because if he was, he would have seen the helicopters, the patrol cars, the news cameras. He would have seen the fear. And still, for years, he remained invisible. The Green River whispered its secrets slowly. And the man responsible was closer than anyone realized. As the investigation expanded, detectives began to sense that they were not chasing a single series of disconnected crimes, but a long, evolving campaign of violence. Each discovery added another piece to a puzzle that refused to form a clear picture. The killer did not follow rigid schedules. He did not strike in predictable bursts. Instead, the murders appeared to ebb and flow, sometimes clustered closely together, sometimes separated by long stretches of silence. This irregular rhythm created a dangerous illusion. During quieter periods, some hoped the threat had passed. Perhaps the killer had died. Perhaps he had moved away. Perhaps he had been incarcerated for something else. But seasoned investigators understood a darker possibility. Serial offenders sometimes pause. They change methods. They adapt. They learn from mistakes. The Green River Killer was not reckless that he left very little behind. Crime scenes rarely contain usable fingerprints. Clothing fibers, when recovered, were often too common to link conclusively to a single source. Witness descriptions were vague and inconsistent. A white man, medium build, dark hair, drove a truck. These details could describe thousands of men in King County alone. What troubled detectives most was the consistency of control. The victims were not typically beaten severely. There were few signs of prolonged assault. Strangulation requires close physical contact. It is intimate. It requires strength. But more importantly, it requires willingness to hold pressure while another human being loses consciousness. The calmness implied by this method suggested someone emotionally detached, someone capable of compartmentalizing his actions. Psychologists consulted on the case proposed that the killer might be driven by deep resentment toward women, particularly those he viewed as disposable or morally inferior. This belief system would allow him to justify his crimes internally. In his mind, he may not have seen himself as a monster at all, that he may have believed he was performing some twisted form of cleansing. Meanwhile, the women who remained alive along Pacific Highway South lived under constant stress. Many altered their routines. Some worked in pairs. Some avoided getting into vehicles altogether, choosing instead to negotiate from sidewalks or well-lit areas. But economic desperation often overpowered fear. Survival required risk. Advocates later argued that society's neglect of these women made them easier targets. The killer understood this. He selected victims whose disappearances might not immediately trigger large-scale searches. People on the margins become invisible faster. This realization haunted investigators. Every missing persons report that arrived too late felt like a personal failure. As years passed, the case grew colder on the surface, but never truly stalled. Evidence was preserved carefully. New forensic techniques were monitored. Detectives revisited old suspects periodically. Tips continued to trickle in. One of the most frustrating aspects of the case was how often the killer brushed past law enforcement without consequence. Gary Ridgway, the truck painter who had been questioned early in the investigation, remained on the periphery of suspicion. He lived a quiet life. He held steady employment. He attended church. He married. To neighbors, he seemed unremarkable. Some described him as socially awkward but harmless. Nothing about his outward behavior screamed serial killer. This normalcy was his greatest camouflage. Behind closed doors, however, Ridgway harbored violent fantasies that had developed long before the Green River murders began. As a teenager, he reportedly stabbed a young boy in a rage. The boy survived. Ridgway later claimed to have been haunted by violent sexual thoughts for years. He struggled with relationships. He felt rejected by women. These internal conflicts festered. But none of this was visible to co-workers or acquaintances. The killer's ability to maintain a routine life added a layer of horror to the case. It meant that evil did not always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it wore work boots and punched a time clock. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, remains continued to be found in wooded areas connected to earlier dumping sites. Some were so decomposed that identification took years or proved impossible. Families waited in agonizing limbo. The not knowing became a form of slow torture. Investigators began to suspect that the true number of victims far exceeded the confirmed count. The killer himself would later confirm this. But at the time, the uncertainty gnawed at everyone involved. Public interest in the case never fully faded. Periodic news specials revisited the mystery. True crime magazines ran cover stories. Each resurgence brought renewed hope that a breakthrough was coming. And yet, for nearly 2 decades, nothing stuck. What finally shifted the trajectory of the case was science. By the late 1990s, DNA analysis had advanced dramatically. Biological material preserved from early crime scenes could now be tested in ways that were impossible in the 1980s. The Green River Task Force revisited stored evidence with cautious optimism. In 2001, investigators obtained a DNA sample from Gary Ridgway during routine surveillance. This time, they had something to compare it against. The results were definitive. The DNA matched samples recovered from several Green River victims. After nearly 20 years, the Whispering River had finally spoken clearly. Gary Ridgway was arrested in November 2001. When confronted with the evidence, he did not resist. He did not deny. Instead, he eventually began to confess. What he revealed stunned even veteran detectives. Ridgway admitted to killing dozens of women. He claimed the number exceeded 70. He described picking them up along the highway, strangling them, and disposing of their bodies in familiar wooded locations. He said he killed to satisfy sexual urges and to eliminate witnesses. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly. There was no grandiosity, no dramatic flair, only chilling simplicity. In 2003, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For families, the conviction brought a measure of closure, but it could never bring back what had been taken. The Green River case stands as a stark reminder of how long evil can hide behind ordinary faces. It exposes the vulnerabilities in systems meant to protect the marginalized, and it forces society to confront uncomfortable truths about whose lives are valued and whose disappear quietly. The river still flows today. It looks peaceful again, but for those who know its history, it will always carry echoes, not just of death, but of voices that were ignored for too long. Chapter 2. A troubled childhood in the shadows. Long before the Green River became synonymous with fear, long before investigators assembled task forces and helicopters hovered over dense Washington forests, there was a boy growing up in Salt Lake City, Utah. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway, born on February 18, 1949. On the surface, his childhood did not look extraordinary. He lived in a modest household with his parents and 2 brothers. The family struggled financially, but that alone was not unusual for the time. Yet beneath the ordinary structure of suburban life, something darker was forming. Ridgway's father, Thomas, worked as a bus driver. He was described as domineering, often angry, and quick to criticize. Gary later portrayed his father as intimidating and emotionally distant. His mother, Mary, was deeply religious, controlling, and, according to Ridgway's own later accounts, overbearing. She reportedly humiliated him about his bedwetting problem well into adolescence, washing soiled sheets in front of him and sometimes shaming him publicly. These early humiliations mattered at bedwetting, particularly when accompanied by parental punishment or ridicule, has been cited in some criminal psychology studies as one of several stressors that can contribute to long-term emotional damage. It does not create violence on its own, but in certain personalities, it can combine with resentment, shame, and social isolation in powerful ways that Ridgway's relationship with his mother would later become a disturbing theme in his life story. He described feeling both intense attachment and deep anger toward her. She was dominant. She controlled the household. She made him feel small. In later confessions, Ridgway spoke about a complicated mixture of sexual confusion and rage that began forming during adolescence that he struggled academically. Teachers described him as having below-average intelligence. He performed poorly in school and often felt inadequate compared to peers. This sense of inferiority followed him into adulthood. Ridgway frequently felt disrespected or rejected, particularly by women at age 16. He committed his first known act of serious violence. He lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. Miraculously, the child survived. The attack was not widely publicized, and Ridgway faced minimal legal consequences. Later, he claimed he simply wanted to know what it felt like to kill someone. That statement would echo decades later with chilling clarity. After high school, Ridgway enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1969. Military service might have offered structure, discipline, and direction. For some, it becomes a stabilizing force. For Ridgway, it became another environment in which his internal conflicts intensified. While stationed overseas during the Vietnam War era, he began engaging in frequent visits to sex workers. He later admitted to violent sexual fantasies during this period. The pattern was emerging that Ridgway's interactions with women were shaped by resentment and insecurity. He desired intimacy, yet he struggled to form healthy emotional connections. He married his first wife at 19. The marriage was brief and turbulent. She later described him as excessively sexual and demanding. The relationship ended quickly. His second marriage, beginning in the early 1970s, lasted longer but was similarly unstable. During this time, Ridgway worked various jobs before eventually becoming a truck painter at a Kenworth factory in Washington. He settled in the Seattle area, the very region that would later become central to his crimes. Colleagues described him as quiet and somewhat socially awkward. He did not stand out. He was not charismatic. He was not particularly threatening. In many ways, he blended into the industrial background of the Pacific Northwest, just another worker in coveralls, punching in and out. But privately, his obsessions were growing. Ridgway later confessed that he developed a fixation on sex workers early in his adult life. He claimed he viewed them as morally corrupt and felt justified in harming them. This rationalization is critical to understanding his psychology. By dehumanizing his victims, he reduced internal guilt. In his mind, they were not fully people. They were symbols of his frustration. His third marriage, to a woman named Judith, appeared stable from the outside. Friends described their relationship as ordinary. Ridgway attended church regularly. He read the Bible. He even spoke about religion with acquaintances. The contrast between this outward piety and his inner violence would later shock the public. One disturbing aspect of his early adulthood was his reported habit of choking women during sexual encounters. At least one sex worker later reported that he had assaulted her but stopped short of killing her. This occurred before the Green River murders were widely known. At the time, such reports did not connect him definitively to a larger pattern. The seeds of violence were no longer theoretical. They were rehearsals. By the late 1970s, Ridgway's fantasies had crossed into action. He later admitted that he committed his first confirmed murder in 1982. but evidence suggests he may have experimented with violence earlier. The escalation from fantasy to murder rarely happens overnight. It builds slowly, fed by repetition, secrecy, and the absence of consequences. What makes Ridgway's background particularly unsettling is how unremarkable it appears when compared to other notorious serial offenders. There were no spectacular childhood traumas involving extreme abuse, no long criminal record filled with escalating felonies, no dramatic psychological breakdowns that alarmed neighbors. Instead, there was mediocrity. Mediocrity mixed with resentment that Ridgway's life was defined not by ambition or grandiosity, but by a simmering internal narrative in which he saw himself as wronged. Women, especially those involved in sex work, became the embodiment of that grievance. In interviews after his arrest, he often described his murders in detached language. He did not boast. He did not romanticize. He explained them almost as practical solutions to impulses. This emotional flatness is what investigators later described as chilling. He was not driven by chaos. He was driven by routine. The environment of the early 1980s Pacific Northwest created conditions that made his crimes easier to conceal. Economic shifts had increased street-level sex work along certain corridors. Police resources were stretched. Communication between agencies was slower than it would become decades later. Missing persons cases involving marginalized individuals often received less urgency. Ridgway observed all of this that he learned the geography. He memorized secluded dumping sites. He noted how long it took for disappearances to draw attention. He was patient. The troubled boy from Utah had grown into a man capable of extraordinary compartmentalization. He could attend a church service in the morning and prowl Pacific Highway south at night. He could go to work on Monday as though nothing had happened over the weekend. He did not need notoriety, he needed control. And control, once tasted, can become addictive. As the early 1980s approached, Ridgway stood at a psychological crossroads. The fantasies that had once lived only in his mind were ready to manifest fully. The resentment that had simmered for decades was about to erupt into a series of crimes that would redefine criminal investigation in Washington state. The river had not yet whispered his name, but the shadows were already moving. By the time Gary Ridgway entered his early 30s, the foundations of his inner world were firmly set. His resentments had hardened into belief systems. His fantasies had become repetitive mental rituals. And his outward life, steady job, modest home, quiet routines, provided the perfect cover for what was unfolding beneath the surface. He did not view himself as broken. He did not view himself as dangerous. In his own mind, Ridgway believed he was in control. Control, to him, meant eliminating unpredictability. It meant choosing victims he believed society would not fight for. It meant operating in environments where transactions were informal and rarely documented. It meant leaving no witnesses. Ridgway later explained that he preferred sex workers because he believed they were unlikely to be reported missing quickly. He also believed that police would not prioritize their cases. This was not accidental logic. It was calculated selection. The psychology behind this thinking reveals something crucial. Ridgway did not kill impulsively in moments of emotional overload. He planned. He selected. He rehearsed. His crimes were solutions to internal tension, not explosions of uncontrolled rage. This distinction matters that it places Ridgway in the category of organized serial offenders. Individuals in this group tend to be methodical, patient, and capable of maintaining outwardly normal lives. They often feel superior to law enforcement and believe they are smarter than the systems meant to catch them. Ridgway never displayed theatrical arrogance, but internally he believed he was untouchable. His religious involvement added a disturbing layer to this self-image. Ridgway attended church regularly and sometimes spoke about wanting to be a good Christian. He prayed. He read scripture. He even sought spiritual counseling at various points. Yet none of this prevented him from killing. Instead, he compartmentalized I in his mind. Church was one part of his identity. Killing was another. The two did not conflict because he did not allow them to intersect emotionally. This type of mental partitioning is common among highly organized offenders. It allows them to avoid cognitive dissonance. Ridgway did not experience guilt in a way most people recognize. When guilt did surface, he attempted to neutralize it by framing his victims as deserving. This internal narrative protected his self-image. Another key element of Ridgway's psychology was sexual control. He reported difficulty achieving sexual satisfaction with consenting partners. His arousal became increasingly linked to domination and strangulation. This connection between sexual pleasure and power is one of the most dangerous psychological pathways in violent offenders. Once such a link is established, escalation is common. Fantasy alone eventually becomes insufficient, but Ridgway's early assaults were testing grounds. He learned how much pressure was needed to render someone unconscious. He learned how quickly a person could stop breathing. He learned how to maintain composure during violent acts. Each rehearsal reduced internal resistance. By 1982, Ridgway was no longer experimenting. He was fully operational. The first known murder attributed to him involved a teenage girl he picked up along Pacific Highway South. He offered money. He drove her to a secluded location. He strangled her with his hands. He left her body near the Green River. This pattern would repeat dozens of times. What separated Ridgway from many other serial offenders was the simplicity of his method. He did not use elaborate restraints. He did not rely on complex rituals. He used his body, his hands, sometimes a ligature such as a rope or piece of clothing. Simple methods reduce opportunities for error. They also reduce forensic traces. Ridgway was not highly intelligent in an academic sense, but he possessed practical criminal intelligence. He learned from observation. He adapted. He noted which dumping sites remained undisturbed. He returned to places that felt safe. He avoided drawing attention to himself. He also kept souvenirs. Ridgway later admitted to revisiting some body sites to engage in sexual acts with the remains. This aspect of his behavior places him within a particularly disturbing subset of offenders who derive prolonged gratification from their crimes. The murder itself is not the end point. It is part of a larger cycle of possession and control. These acts were performed in secret, and no one around him suspected that at work, Ridgway was reliable. He showed up on time. He completed tasks. He rarely caused problems. Supervisors saw him as a quiet but dependable employee at home. His wife believed he was faithful in public. He appeared unremarkable. This ability to live a double life is one of the most frightening aspects of organized serial offenders. It challenges the comforting belief that evil is easily recognizable. Ridgway demonstrates that monstrous behavior can coexist with mundane routines. As the body count rose, Ridgway became more confident. He noticed news coverage. He followed updates about the investigation. He knew police were searching for a truck driving suspect. He knew composite sketches were being circulated. And still, he continued. Why? Because he believed he had already beaten the system that he had been questioned early in the investigation and released. He had passed a polygraph test. In his mind, this confirmed his superiority. It reinforced the belief that he could not be caught. This moment may have been the most dangerous turning point of all. Once an offender believes law enforcement is incapable of stopping them, their sense of invincibility can escalate rapidly. Ridgway began killing more frequently. He refined his approach. He selected victims with even greater care. yet he never sought publicity. He did not want fame. He did not want recognition. Attention increased risk. Silence was safer. This preference for anonymity distinguishes Ridgway from many serial offenders who crave notoriety. His motivation was not performance. It was satisfaction, quiet, private, repetitive. Over time, the internal world Ridgway had built became his true reality. His outward life was merely camouflage. The truck painter persona was a costume he wore to move through society unnoticed. The troubled boy from Utah had become something far more dangerous than a volatile criminal. He had become a predator who understood patience, that he waited, he watched, that he selected. And soon, the river would begin receiving the consequences of everything that had been forming inside him for decades. Chapter 3: The Making of a Predator. By the early 1980s, the transformation was complete. Gary Ridgway was no longer a man wrestling with violent fantasies. He was a man acting on them with disturbing regularity. The shift from troubled individual to systematic predator did not happen in a dramatic explosion. It unfolded quietly, methodically, almost invisibly, like a tide rising at night while a city sleeps. To understand how he became one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, it is necessary to examine not only what he did, but how he did it. Ridgway did not stalk victims in the traditional cinematic sense. He did not lurk in dark alleyways waiting for opportunity to strike spontaneously. Instead, he operated within a predictable ecosystem, the stretch of Pacific Highway south in King County, Washington. This corridor, lined with budget motels, convenience stores, and truck stops, had become known as a place where sex work was visible and frequent. Ridgway entered this environment as a customer. He drove slowly, often in his pickup truck, sometimes circling the same blocks multiple times. He would make eye contact. He would negotiate calmly. He projected the demeanor of a man seeking a simple transaction. There was no urgency in his approach. This calmness disarmed people. Survivors who later described encounters with him noted that he did not appear threatening at first. He was soft-spoken. He avoided dramatic gestures. He sometimes showed photographs of his son to create an image of normalcy. These tactics were not random. They were rehearsed elements of social camouflage. Ridgway understood something critical. Fear disrupts compliance. Calmness invites it. Once a woman agreed to enter his vehicle, he maintained the illusion of routine. He drove to locations he had pre-selected: wooded areas, service roads, gravel pits, riverbanks. These were places he had scouted carefully over time. Some were near his home. Some were along routes he traveled regularly for work. He favored familiarity. Familiar terrain reduces risk. It increases confidence. It allows for faster exits. Most of the murders followed a similar pattern. After engaging in sexual activity, sometimes consensual at first, Ridgway would suddenly initiate strangulation. The attack was swift. He often used his arm around the neck from behind, cutting off airflow before the victim could fully react. There was no drawn-out confrontation. The efficiency of the act is one of the most chilling aspects of his crimes. Strangulation requires sustained force for several minutes to ensure death. It demands proximity. It demands focus. Ridgway later admitted that he sometimes counted silently in his head to ensure he applied pressure long enough. This detail reveals a calculated patience. After the murder, Ridgway transported the body to a dumping site. He frequently left victims partially concealed by brush or natural debris. In some cases, he arranged the bodies deliberately. Investigators later found clusters of remains in specific areas, suggesting he returned repeatedly to locations he considered safe. He was creating private graveyards. The act of returning to these sites became part of his ritual. Ridgway later confessed that he revisited bodies to relive the experience and to exert continued control. This behavior reflects a psychological need not just for killing, but for possession. The forest became an extension of his internal world, quiet, hidden, undisturbed. Meanwhile, his daily life continued uninterrupted. He went to work painting trucks at Kenworth. He attended church services. He socialized occasionally with neighbors. He maintained his marriage. There were no visible cracks in his public persona. The duality was seamless. This dual existence raises an unsettling question. How can someone commit repeated acts of extreme violence while maintaining ordinary routines? The answer lies in compartmentalization. Ridgway did not allow emotional crossover between his identities. Work was work. Home was home. Murder was something else entirely, a separate compartment sealed off from conscience. In interviews years later, he described his crimes without visible emotion. His tone remained flat, detached, that he did not express remorse in a conventional way. What he expressed instead was pragmatism. Ridgway believed killing eliminated problems. If a victim threatened to identify him, he killed her. If he felt sexual frustration, he killed to release it. If he believed someone might connect him to prior encounters, he eliminated the risk. This utilitarian mindset stripped murder of moral weight in his internal logic. As his confidence grew, so did his frequency. The year 1982 marked the beginning of what would become the most active phase of his killing. Multiple women disappeared within months. Their bodies began surfacing along the Green River and in nearby wooded areas. The press took notice. Police mobilized. Ridgway observed all of it. He later admitted that he followed news reports closely. He paid attention to suspect descriptions. He listened to community warnings. He adjusted accordingly. If patrols increased in one area, he shifted to another. If public attention intensified, he waited. Predators thrive on adaptation. One particularly disturbing element of Ridgway's behavior was his ability to appear helpful when questioned. When police interviewed him in 1982, he presented himself as cooperative. He allowed searches of his property. He answered questions calmly. He passed a polygraph test that TO investigators at the time. He did not raise enough suspicion to justify detention. For Ridgway, this moment reinforced his belief in his own invisibility. The making of a predator is not solely about violence. It is about learning what works. Ridgway learned that calmness deflected suspicion. He learned that targeting marginalized individuals reduced immediate investigative pressure. He learned that simplicity minimized forensic evidence. Each successful crime strengthened the pattern. There is a dangerous feedback loop in serial offending. The absence of consequences becomes proof of skill. Skill becomes confidence. Confidence reduces hesitation. Reduced hesitation increases frequency. By late 1982, that loop was fully operational. Ridgway was no longer experimenting. He was refining that he understood timing. He understood geography. He understood human vulnerability. And perhaps most dangerously, he understood that society often looks away from those living on its edges. The Green River was not random. It was strategic. It provided concealment, accessibility, and psychological symbolism. Water washes away evidence. Forests obscure visibility. Remote terrain delays discovery. Ridgway did not need elaborate planning sessions. His routine became his strategy: drive, select, strangle, dispose, return home, repeat. The terrifying aspect of this cycle is its ordinariness. There were no elaborate disguises, no high-speed chases, no dramatic confessions, just repetition. And with each repetition, the predator within him grew stronger. The city did not yet know how many lives had already been taken, but the river was beginning to whisper louder. As Gary Ridgway's killing routine became ingrained, something subtle but profound occurred within his psychology. Murder began to feel normal, not in the sense that it lost intensity, but in the sense that it became integrated into the structure of his life. It existed alongside grocery shopping, commuting to work, and attending church. It did not disrupt his schedule. It did not require elaborate preparation. It fit. This normalization is one of the most dangerous stages in the evolution of a serial offender. When an act becomes routine, moral resistance erodes. What once required internal justification now requires none. The behavior sustains itself. Ridgway later admitted that he sometimes felt an urge to kill building throughout the day, like pressure accumulating behind a wall. Driving home from work, he would already be planning his route along Pacific Highway South. He would already be scanning for potential victims. This premeditation was quiet. There were no dramatic fantasies of bloodshed or chaos. His thoughts were practical. Who looked vulnerable? Who appeared alone? Who might be willing to enter a truck quickly? He did not select victims based on personal grudges. They were interchangeable in his mind. This depersonalization allowed him to avoid emotional engagement. They were not individuals. They were opportunities. Once a woman entered his vehicle, Ridgway shifted into what could be described as operational mode. He became focused, task-oriented, calm. This psychological state is similar to what some criminals describe as a form of tunnel vision. External distractions fade. Only the objective remains. After killing, Ridgway experienced a sense of relief. Not joy, not excitement. Relief. The pressure was gone. But relief is temporary. Over time, the interval between urges shortened. The calm period shrank. This is a hallmark of addiction-like behavior. The brain begins to crave the cycle itself. Ridgway did not see this as loss of control, that he saw it as necessity. This belief that killing was something he had to do became a central part of his internal narrative. It allowed him to view himself not as a villain, but as someone managing an uncontrollable condition. This self-perception is profoundly dangerous because it removes accountability. Another critical component of Ridgway's development was his evolving relationship with risk. In the early phase, he exercised extreme caution. He avoided victims who appeared assertive. He avoided areas with heavy police presence. He avoided taking anyone who might easily be traced. As his confidence grew, small risks became acceptable. He occasionally took victims from bus stops. He sometimes picked up women who knew his name or had seen him before. He began returning to the same dumping sites repeatedly. These behaviors suggest not recklessness, but perceived mastery. He believed he understood the system well enough to bend its rules. Ridgway also began experimenting with body placement. Some victims were left face down. Some were left in positions that investigators later interpreted as deliberate. While he did not engage in elaborate staging, there was an element of control in how he left bodies behind, that he wanted them hidden, but not too hidden that he wanted them found eventually. This paradox points to a complex motivation. Ridgway did not seek fame, but he did want acknowledgement of his power. The discovery of bodies served as confirmation that his actions had impact. He did not need his name attached. He needed proof that he existed. The investigation's early struggles unintentionally reinforced his sense of dominance. Task forces were created. Press conferences were held. Composite sketches circulated. None of it stopped him in his mind. Each passing month without arrest was evidence that he was smarter than the authorities. This belief strengthened his internal identity as a predator. Identity is crucial. Once someone fully embraces a self-concept, behavior aligns with it. Ridgway did not think of himself as a man who sometimes killed, that he thought of himself as a killer. That distinction matters. It explains why he did not attempt to seek meaningful psychological help. It explains why religious counseling did not deter him. It explains why he could sit in church listening to sermons about morality and feel no internal contradiction. Those messages were for other people, not for him. Another aspect of Ridgway's development was emotional shallowness. He did not form deep bonds. His marriages were functional rather than intimate. He did not have close friendships. His emotional world was narrow. This emotional poverty created space for obsession to flourish. When someone lacks healthy sources of meaning, destructive behaviors can fill the void that Ridgway's world became small. Work, home, highway, forest, repeat. The simplicity of this loop made it sustainable. Investigators later noted that Ridgway's IQ was below average. This has sometimes been misunderstood as evidence that he was unintelligent. In reality, intelligence is multidimensional. Ridgway lacked academic aptitude, but he possessed situational awareness and pattern recognition. He learned through repetition that he learned what attracted suspicion, that he learned what did not. He learned how long it took for bodies to be discovered. He learned which sites remained undisturbed. This form of learning does not require high IQ, that IT requires attention. Ridgway paid attention as the body count grew. He did not experience a corresponding increase in emotional reaction. There was no escalation toward more dramatic violence, no shift toward public displays, no desire to change methods. This consistency is unusual among serial offenders. Many escalate. Ridgway maintained. This stability suggests that his chosen method fulfilled his psychological needs efficiently. He had found a formula that worked, and so he repeated it. The making of a predator is often imagined as a dramatic transformation in reality. It is more often a quiet crystallization, that a series of small choices, that a series of internal justifications, that a series of successful transgressions. Over time, those elements harden into identity by the mid-1980s. Gary Ridgway was no longer evolving, he was fully formed. He had become what he would remain for nearly 2 decades, an invisible man, driving familiar roads, carrying familiar urges, leaving behind a trail of silence that stretched far longer than anyone yet understood. Chapter 4. First Blood and Silent Escalation. The first confirmed murders attributed to Gary Ridgway did not announce themselves with spectacle. There were no dramatic crime scenes surrounded by flashing lights and television crews. There was only absence, a missing person. Then another in early 1982. Young women began disappearing along the Pacific Highway South Corridor. For many, this stretch of road was a workplace. It was where survival unfolded hour by hour. Cheap motels flickered with neon signs. Trucks rolled past at all hours. Deals were negotiated quickly. Names were rarely exchanged. It was an ecosystem built on anonymity. Ridgway understood this deeply. His first known victim, 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield, was reported missing in July 1982. She had been last seen near the highway. Days later, her body was found floating in the Green River. She had been strangled at the time. Investigators did not yet know they were witnessing the opening act of one of the deadliest serial murder cases in American history. Soon after, Deborah Bonner, age 23, disappeared. Her remains were found in the same river weeks later. Then Marcia Chapman. Then Cynthia Hines. The names accumulated quietly, like pages in a file drawer that grew heavier with each edition. By late summer, the pattern was undeniable. Young women, strangulation, bodies near or in the Green River. The press began using a name that would echo for decades, the Green River Killer. But in those early months, fear had not yet reached its peak. The community struggled to grasp the scale of what was unfolding. Some assumed the crimes were isolated incidents tied to the dangers of street life. Others suspected multiple perpetrators. Ridgway, meanwhile, continued with chilling steadiness. What defined this early phase was experimentation with inconsistency. He was testing how quickly victims would be reported missing. He was observing police response times. He was gauging media attention. And most importantly, he was learning that he could do this repeatedly without immediate consequence. Strangulation became his signature not because it was theatrical, but because it was efficient. It required no weapon purchase, no visible tool that could link him to the crime. His hands left little trace, especially in an era before advanced DNA profiling. The act was quiet. There were no gunshots to attract attention. The silence mattered. Ridgway preferred minimal disruption. He often killed inside his vehicle or shortly after reaching a secluded spot. He did not transport victims long distances. He favored wooded patches just off service roads or near the riverbanks he had memorized. The geography of King County became his ally. Dense forests offered natural concealment. Seasonal rainfall accelerated decomposition. Wildlife scattered remains. These environmental factors complicated forensic analysis. But beyond geography, there was psychology. Ridgway was not driven by rage in the traditional sense. There were no explosive arguments preceding most murders. Instead, there was calculation. If a woman asked too many questions, if she resisted, if she appeared capable of identifying him later, he eliminated the risk. He later described this phase with startling simplicity. He killed to reduce problems. This reductionist thinking stripped his victims of individuality. They were obstacles, not people. Yet behind each name was a life filled with complexity. Daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. Some had struggled with addiction. Some had run away from abusive homes. Some were trying to support children. Their vulnerabilities were real, but so were their hopes. Ridgway did not see hope. He saw opportunity. As summer turned to autumn in 1982, the number of discovered bodies increased. Law enforcement formed a dedicated task force. Helicopters scanned wooded areas. Search teams combed riverbanks. Thousands of tips flooded in. Ridgway watched all of this unfold. He did not flee, he did not panic. Instead, he adapted. He began spacing out some of the killings. He varied dumping sites slightly. He occasionally left bodies further from water to reduce clustering. These adjustments suggest active monitoring of the investigation. Predators learn from their hunters. One of the most unsettling elements of this early escalation was Ridgway's ability to resume normal activities immediately after a murder. He would return home, wash his hands, eat dinner, and sleep. There was no visible emotional residue. This emotional detachment challenges common assumptions about guilt. Many people imagine that committing such acts would leave obvious psychological scars. In Ridgway's case, the scars were internalized differently. Instead of trauma, he experienced reinforcement. Each successful crime strengthened his sense of capability. Each missed opportunity for arrest increased his confidence. The task force interviewed hundreds of potential suspects in 1982 alone. They examined vehicle registrations, conducted surveillance along the highway, and administered polygraph tests to individuals who fit partial descriptions. Ridgway was among those questioned. In August 1982, he voluntarily met with detectives. He answered questions calmly. He allowed officers to search his home and vehicle. He denied involvement. He passed a polygraph examination. At that moment, the trajectory of the case shifted, though no one realized it. The man they were searching for had just walked out of the interview room. For Ridgway, this encounter became a turning point. It confirmed his belief that he could outmaneuver law enforcement. Passing the polygraph emboldened him. He later admitted that he felt a sense of relief followed by renewed confidence. The silent escalation intensified by the end of 1982. The confirmed victim count was already in double digits. Bodies were discovered in clusters along the river and in wooded areas near the Seattle-Tacoma airport. Some were so decomposed that identification required dental records and months of forensic work. Families endured agonizing waits. The press amplified the fear. Community meetings filled with anxious residents demanding answers. And through it all, Ridgway remained invisible. The phrase "first blood" often suggests a dramatic beginning. In reality, Ridgway's first confirmed killings were quiet openings to a long, sustained campaign of violence. There was no crescendo, only accumulation. One victim at a time. One concealed body at a time. One unnoticed drive home at a time. The escalation was not loud. It was steady, and steadiness, in this context, was far more dangerous. As 1982 moved into 1983, the tempo of violence did not collapse under the weight of investigation. Instead, it settled into something even more unnerving. Endurance. By early 1983, the Green River Task Force had grown into one of the largest serial murder investigations in United States history at the time. Dozens of detectives worked full-time. Analysts reviewed maps dotted with colored pins marking body recovery sites. Search teams scoured wooded ravines and overgrown embankments. The case consumed resources, headlines, and public imagination. And yet, the killings did not fully stop. Ridgway adjusted. He became more selective about when and where he picked up victims. Increased patrol presence along Pacific Highway South forced subtle changes in timing. He sometimes drove further before stopping. He occasionally used secondary roads instead of primary corridors, but he did not abandon his routine. This persistence reveals something crucial about escalation. It is not always about increasing brutality. Sometimes it is about increasing commitment. Ridgway had crossed too many lines to retreat. The pattern had become embedded. Another disturbing feature of this period was the clustering of body disposal sites. Investigators began discovering remains in groups. Multiple victims left within relatively close proximity to one another. This pattern suggested that Ridgway was returning to familiar locations repeatedly. Why return? Because familiarity breeds confidence. Returning to the same sites meant he understood the terrain. He knew which areas were rarely visited. He knew how seasonal changes affected visibility. Dense foliage in summer concealed remains effectively. In winter, fallen leaves could expose them. But by then, decomposition often complicated identification. Ridgway thought in cycles, seasonal cycles, police shift cycles, media cycles. When attention peaked, he reduced activity. When headlines faded, he resumed. This ability to synchronize his behavior with external pressure is one of the defining elements of his escalation phase. He was not operating in isolation from the investigation. He was observing it. In interviews years later, Ridgway admitted that he sometimes drove past search parties looking for missing women. He described feeling calm while watching officers comb through areas near where he had previously left bodies. He did not insert himself dramatically into investigations, but he remained close enough to monitor. This proximity to discovery did not frighten him. It reinforced his belief that he was in control. The emotional detachment persisted. Ridgway did not describe experiencing panic during close calls. Instead, he described calculation. If a victim resisted strongly or attempted to memorize details about him, he reacted quickly. Strangulation became not just a means of killing, but a means of maintaining dominance in the moment. Control was everything. The escalation also included a subtle psychological shift. As the body count rose, Ridgway's internal justification solidified. He convinced himself that he was performing a service by removing individuals he deemed undesirable. This distorted moral reasoning insulated him from remorse. He once explained that he believed sex workers were less likely to be missed. This belief, whether entirely accurate or not, shaped his targeting strategy. It reveals a broader societal failure, the marginalization of vulnerable communities that predators can exploit. The investigation, meanwhile, grew increasingly complex. Detectives collected carpet fibers, paint samples, tire impressions, and witness statements. Composite sketches were circulated widely. One description mentioned a man with a pickup truck and a sometimes friendly demeanor. Thousands of tips poured in. Ridgway's name surfaced more than once. In 1983, police conducted surveillance on him for a period of time. They examined his work schedule. They analyzed his movements. They even obtained samples from his vehicle, but without definitive forensic links. And in the absence of modern DNA profiling, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. Ridgway slipped back into the background. The frustration within the task force grew. Each new body discovery felt like both evidence and failure. Detectives were acutely aware that the killer was still active. Every day without arrest meant potential new victims. Community fear intensified. Parents warned daughters not to travel alone. Women working along the highway formed informal networks to share information about dangerous clients. Advocacy groups demanded stronger protections for marginalized women. Tension between police and sex workers sometimes complicated communication, but both groups understood the stakes. Ridgway continued his pattern through 1983 and into 1984 that the pace fluctuated, but the method remained constant. There were no signature messages that no taunts, no grandstanding. Just repetition. This lack of theatrics made the case harder to psychologically grasp. Many serial killers seek recognition or communicate with media. Ridgway did neither. His silence was strategic. Silence reduces exposure. During this period, something else occurred that would later prove significant: evidence preservation. Though investigators could not yet analyze biological samples with the precision available decades later, they stored them carefully. Clothing fibers, semen samples, hair fragments. These pieces of evidence sat dormant, waiting for technology to catch up. Ridgway did not account for the future. He believed the present was enough. As the mid-1980s approached, the visible intensity of the killings appeared to decline. Fewer bodies were being discovered annually. Whether this represented a true reduction or simply delayed discovery was unclear. Some theorized the killer had moved. Others believed he had been incarcerated under a different identity. But Ridgway had not disappeared. He had simply slowed. This slowing phase is often misinterpreted as de-escalation. In reality, it can represent consolidation. The offender becomes more cautious, more selective, less frequent, but no less capable. For families of victims, the distinction did not matter. The damage had already been done. By the end of this early escalation phase, dozens of lives had been lost. The Green River had become shorthand for terror. The task force had interviewed thousands, and the man responsible continued driving the same roads, clocking into the same job, sleeping in the same bed. The escalation had not been explosive. It had been patient, and patience allowed it to endure. Chapter 5. The Highway of Lost Girl. Pacific Highway South stretches like a long gray ribbon through parts of King County, Washington. By day, it looks ordinary, a working road lined with small businesses, gas stations, warehouses, and low-cost motels. Traffic moves steadily. Trucks rumble past. People go about their routines. By night. In the early 1980s, the atmosphere shifted. Neon lights glowed against damp pavement. Headlights cut through mist. The air carried the mixed scent of gasoline, rain, and stale smoke. Along certain sections of the highway, women stood under streetlights or near motel entrances, scanning passing vehicles. calculating risk with every glance. For many, this road was not a choice. It was survival. Economic hardship, addiction, abusive relationships, and lack of support systems funneled vulnerable individuals into this corridor. Some had run away from home as teenagers. Some were trying to feed children. Some were trapped in cycles they did not know how to escape. The highway became a marketplace of desperation. Gary Ridgway recognized this instantly. He did not invent the danger of Pacific Highway South. He exploited it. Ridgway drove this road repeatedly, often without picking anyone up. These were not wasted trips. They were reconnaissance. He learned where women tended to stand at different hours. He learned which motels rented rooms without demanding identification. He learned which areas were poorly lit and which were heavily patrolled. This knowledge accumulation was slow and deliberate. Over time, the highway became mapped in his mind, not as a road, but as a hunting ground point. One of the most chilling aspects of Ridgway's behavior was how ordinary his presence appeared. He did not cruise aggressively. He did not shout offers from his window. He did not behave erratically. He blended into the steady flow of traffic. When he stopped, he spoke quietly. He negotiated price. He asked simple questions. He sometimes smiled. This normalcy disarmed people who had learned to be suspicious of obvious danger. Ridgway did not look like danger. He looked like another customer. Women working the highway were accustomed to managing risk. They developed instincts. They watched body language. They avoided men who seemed intoxicated or volatile. They trusted subtle cues. Ridgway learned how to present himself as low risk. He avoided raised voices. He avoided sudden movements. He did not argue about money. He did not rush. In a world where chaos was common, calm felt safe. Once a woman entered his vehicle, Ridgway maintained the illusion. He drove as though heading toward a motel or prearranged location. He did not immediately turn into wooded areas. He eased into isolation gradually. This gradual shift reduced alarm. It gave him time to assess the victim's demeanor. If she appeared nervous or asked too many questions, he sometimes abandoned the encounter. This selectivity further reduced risk. The highway was not merely a place of opportunity. It was a filter. It allowed Ridgway to choose. The phrase highway of lost girls later emerged in media as a way to describe the pattern of disappearances. But behind the phrase were individual stories. Teenagers who had run away after family conflicts. Young women escaping abusive homes. Mothers struggling with addiction. Friends who had promised to meet someone later and never returned. Their lives intersected briefly with Pacific Highway South, then vanished. Ridgway rarely remembered their names. He did not ask about their histories. That he did not care. This emotional blankness is essential to understanding his psychology. He was not killing specific people. He was killing a category. The highway provided that category in abundance. Law enforcement recognized the corridor as a focal point early in the investigation. Patrols increased. Undercover officers posed as sex workers. Surveillance cameras were installed near certain motels. Warning flyers circulated among women working the area. But Pacific Highway South is long, and Ridgway was patient. When police concentrated on one stretch, he shifted to another. When undercover operations became more visible, he waited. The sheer size of the area made comprehensive coverage impossible. Another factor complicated enforcement: trust. Many women working along the highway did not trust police. Past experiences of arrest, harassment, or indifference created barriers. Some feared being jailed if they reported suspicious clients. Others believed nothing would change. Ridgway exploited this gap. He understood that silence protected him. Some women did report near-fatal encounters with men who attempted to strangle them. In hindsight, these incidents appear as warnings. But at the time, without forensic links, They were isolated complaints. Ridgway passed through these cracks. The highway also offered mobility. Ridgway could pick up a victim in one city and dispose of her in another. Jurisdictional boundaries complicated investigations. Different police departments had different databases. Information sharing was slower than today. This fragmentation benefited him. From Ridgway's perspective, Pacific Highway South was ideal. High volume of potential victims, predictable patterns, multiple access routes, limited witness cooperation, geographic sprawl. It was a system that unintentionally supported predation. But the highway was not only a hunting ground, it was a stage of silent tragedy. Friends waited at agreed-upon meeting spots. Mothers checked voicemail machines. Siblings drove the corridor looking for familiar faces. Each disappearance created ripples of grief that rarely reached headlines. Media coverage often focused on numbers, but numbers do not capture loss. They do not capture the empty chairs at family dinners. They do not capture the unanswered questions. Ridgway did not see ripples, that he saw efficiency. The highway allowed him to act repeatedly without drawing attention to himself as an individual. He was one driver among thousands. This anonymity was his shield. As the years passed, Pacific Highway South became more than a location. It became a symbol of vulnerability, the symbol of societal neglect, the symbol of how certain lives can be systematically placed at risk without widespread outrage. Ridgway did not create that reality, but he used it. And with each drive down that gray ribbon of road, another life teetered on the edge of becoming lost. As the months turned into years, Pacific Highway South developed an unspoken reputation that it was no longer just a place where sex work occurred, that it was a place where people disappeared. Word traveled quietly through informal networks. Women warned each other about certain types of clients. Some spoke about a quiet man in a pickup truck who seemed normal but made their instincts uneasy. Descriptions varied, but a few patterns surfaced. White male, average build, soft-spoken, sometimes friendly. These whispers were fragile threads of information. They were not enough to stop him. The reality of life along the highway was that fear existed alongside necessity. Even when danger felt real, hunger and addiction did not pause. Bills did not disappear. Children still needed food. Shelter still cost money. Ridgway understood this. He knew that even if women suspected risk, many would still accept rides. Desperation narrows choices. One of the most haunting aspects of this period is how close Ridgway sometimes came to being exposed. Several women survived attacks. Some reported being choked until they lost consciousness and later awoke alone. Others fought him off. A few memorized details about his vehicle. These survivors carried critical information. But in the early 1980s, systems for connecting such reports across jurisdictions were limited. A strangulation assault in one city did not automatically link to a murder in another. Patterns that seem obvious in hindsight were fragmented at the time. Ridgway benefited from this fragmentation. The highway itself became a corridor of silence. Motel clerks occasionally noticed men bringing women to rooms who never checked out. But transient clientele was common. Workers did not track names. Records were minimal. Cameras were rare. Truck stops saw hundreds of drivers each night. Ridgway blended in effortlessly. Another layer of tragedy lies in how society viewed the victims. Media coverage often used language that emphasized their involvement in sex work rather than their humanity. Headlines focused on prostitutes slain rather than women murdered. This framing mattered. It subtly suggested that these deaths were expected consequences of risky lifestyles rather than crimes demanding urgent resolution. Ridgway internalized this attitude. He believed the world did not care. And in many ways, the early response confirmed his belief. Families of missing women encountered obstacles when trying to file reports. Some were told to wait. Others were asked if their daughters had a history of running away. Some were treated with skepticism. Time passed. Evidence degraded. Ridgway continued. Yet even within this bleak environment, acts of quiet resistance existed. Some women formed informal buddy systems. They shared license plate numbers. They wrote down descriptions of suspicious vehicles. They tried to look out for one another in small ways. These efforts saved lives, but they could not dismantle a predator operating at scale. The highway's geography further complicated matters. It passed through multiple municipalities: SeaTac, Kent, Auburn, Federal Way, and others. Each had its own police department, its own records, its own priorities. Ridgway moved fluidly across these boundaries. He did not think in terms of cities, he thought in terms of roads. For him, Pacific Highway South was a continuous space. This spatial thinking gave him an advantage. The name Highway of Lost Girls captures the cumulative sorrow associated with this corridor, but it also risks flattening individual stories into abstraction. Each woman who disappeared had a life before the highway. Some had grown up in small towns. Some loved music. Some dreamed of leaving street life behind. Some were trying, unsuccessfully, to get clean. Ridgway never asked, but their families remembered. Mothers posted flyers. Fathers drove the highway at night hoping to spot familiar faces. Siblings called shelters. Friends searched hospitals. Hope lingered long after evidence suggested otherwise. Ridgway, meanwhile, experienced none of this emotional landscape. He experienced only his own internal cycle: urge, search, selection, relief, repeat. The highway became woven into his identity as a killer. It was where he felt most in control. It was where his private world intersected with public space without detection. This sense of ownership is psychologically significant. Some offenders develop attachments to specific locations associated with their crimes. These places become extensions of their inner world. For Ridgway, Pacific Highway South was not just a route. It was a boundary between his two lives. On one side, husband, employee, churchgoer. On the other, predator. Crossing that boundary required no visible transition. He simply drove. As law enforcement continued to focus on the highway, Ridgway subtly altered patterns without abandoning it. He might drive farther before picking someone up. He might choose slightly different spots to initiate contact. He might wait days instead of hours between attempts. These small adjustments were enough. The highway still fed him victims. Another disturbing element of this period was Ridgway's lack of emotional memory for victims. In later interviews, he struggled to recall details about many of the women he killed. Names blurred together. Faces faded. This amnesia was not accidental. It was functional. Remembering individuals would have introduced emotional complexity. Ridgway avoided complexity. Simplicity kept him operational. The Highway of Lost Girls did not become infamous overnight. Its reputation grew slowly, shaped by whispered warnings, grieving families, and a mounting list of names. Ridgway did not feel the weight of that list. He felt only the continuation of his routine. But the highway was quietly recording everything. Every pickup, every disappearance, every silent drive into the trees. And one day, those records would matter. Chapter 6. Inside the Mind of a Methodical Killer. To understand Gary Ridgway's crimes only through timelines and body counts is to miss something essential. Numbers describe scale, but psychology explains endurance. Ridgway did not kill in bursts of uncontrollable fury. He did not spiral visibly. He did not collapse under the weight of what he was doing. Instead, he maintained a steady internal rhythm that allowed him to continue for years without outward breakdown. This consistency is the hallmark of a methodical killer. Methodical does not mean sophisticated, it means repeatable. Ridgway built his crimes around simple, reliable steps that required minimal variation. Simplicity reduced mistakes. Repetition increased confidence. The core of his psychology was emotional detachment. Ridgway did not experience empathy in a conventional sense. He did not place himself in the emotional position of others. When he looked at a victim, he did not imagine her family, her fears, or her future. He saw only a function. Function allowed action. Empathy creates hesitation. Ridgway avoided hesitation. Another central feature of his mind was compartmentalization. He divided his life into sealed compartments that did not bleed into one another. There was the work compartment, the marriage compartment, the religious compartment, the killing compartment. Each existed independently. This structure allowed him to move between identities without internal conflict. He did not feel like a hypocrite for attending church after killing someone. Those actions occupied different psychological rooms. This is not a metaphor. It is a cognitive survival strategy. People who engage in long-term harmful behavior often rely on compartmentalization to preserve a sense of self. Without it, the internal contradictions would become unbearable. Ridgway solved the contradiction by refusing to acknowledge it. He did not see himself as evil, that he saw himself as someone with urges. Urges, in his mind, were natural. Managing them required action. This belief system stripped morality out of the equation. Another crucial aspect of Ridgway's mind was his relationship with power. Power, for him, did not mean public dominance or visible authority. It meant private control over life and death. It meant possessing a secret that no one else knew. It meant deciding who continued to exist. This form of power is silent. It does not require recognition. It does not require applause. It thrives in secrecy. Ridgway's low-profile lifestyle supported this perfectly. He did not draw attention to himself. He did not seek leadership roles. He did not cultivate a strong social presence. Being invisible was a feature, not a flaw. Inside his mind, invisibility equaled safety. Ridgway also demonstrated a utilitarian approach to violence. He killed when it served a purpose. The purpose might be sexual release. The purpose might be eliminating a witness. The purpose might be reducing internal tension. But there was always a perceived function. This functional framing allowed him to avoid viewing murder as extraordinary. It was a tool. Tools are not morally evaluated. They are used. One of the most chilling elements of Ridgway's psychology is his lack of emotional memory. When asked years later about specific victims, he often could not recall details. He sometimes confused names. He sometimes misremembered locations. This was not because the events were insignificant. It was because they were routine. The brain encodes novelty more strongly than repetition. For Ridgway, killing had become repetitive. Repetition breeds forgetting. Another layer to his mind was resentment. Ridgway harbored long-standing anger toward women. This anger was not always conscious. It existed as a background hum. That he felt rejected, he felt inadequate, that he felt controlled. Rather than confronting these feelings, he displaced them onto a category of women he viewed as acceptable targets. Sex workers became symbolic stand-ins for all perceived rejection, by harming them. He symbolically punished the broader group he resented. This displacement allowed him to avoid confronting specific interpersonal failures. It also prevented growth. Instead of asking why relationships failed, he blamed women as a class. This worldview hardened over time. Ridgway also exhibited a need for order, not in a neat freak sense, but in a procedural sense. That he liked routine, that he liked predictability, he liked knowing what would happen next. His killing method fit this need perfectly. Same approach, Same general locations, same sequence. Order creates comfort. Comfort reduces anxiety. For someone with internal chaos, external order becomes soothing. Killing, paradoxically, became a stabilizing activity for Ridgway. This does not mean he was calm in a healthy way. It means he used violence to regulate his internal state. That is profoundly dangerous. Another key feature was his shallow emotional range. Ridgway did not experience intense joy, deep sadness, or strong connection. His emotional world was narrow. Narrow emotional worlds seek stimulation. For some people, stimulation comes from extreme sports or risky behavior. For Ridgway, it came from dominance and control. This connection between emotional emptiness and destructive stimulation is common among long-term violent offenders. The mind adapts to whatever provides feeling. Even if that feeling is twisted, that Ridgway's methodical nature was not genius, that it was persistence. He did not invent new techniques. He did not innovate. He repeated what worked, and because it worked, he had no reason to change. Understanding Ridgway's mind does not mean excusing his actions. It means recognizing patterns. Patterns help explain how such crimes can continue unnoticed. Patterns reveal vulnerabilities in systems. Patterns show us where intervention might have been possible. Inside Ridgway's mind, there was no dramatic internal battle between good and evil. There was only routine, and routine, when aligned with violence, becomes catastrophic. Silence is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of conflict. Ridgway did not experience his crimes as moral crises. He did not wrestle with sleepless nights filled with guilt. Instead, his internal world operated with a chilling steadiness that allowed him to move forward without emotional collapse. One of the most striking aspects of Ridgway's later confessions was how ordinary his tone remained. He did not dramatize. He did not embellish. He did not seek sympathy. He described killing as if describing mechanical work, something done repeatedly, efficiently, and without flourish. This flat effect is significant in many offenders, especially those seeking attention. There is a need to relive crimes with intensity. Ridgway did not appear to need that. The acts themselves had already fulfilled their purpose. Revisiting them emotionally held little value. This detachment suggests a mind that had reduced violence to function. But beneath the function was something else: control over unpredictability. Ridgway lived with deep insecurities. His childhood left him feeling inadequate and humiliated. His adult relationships often reinforced those feelings. Women, in particular, represented emotional complexity he struggled to manage. Strangulation eliminated complexity. It reduced interaction to a single, controllable outcome. The act required physical closeness, but it erased emotional negotiation. It ended uncertainty. It replaced vulnerability with dominance. In this way, murder became a distorted solution to internal instability. Ridgway's method also reveals a preference for minimal confrontation. He did not enjoy drawn-out struggles. He sought quick submission. The moment resistance ceased was the moment he felt power restored. Power, to him, was quiet. He did not need witnesses. He did not need trophies displayed. He did not need headlines. He needed secrecy. Secrecy amplified power. Knowing something no one else knew. Carrying dozens of hidden crimes while appearing ordinary created a private superiority. He walked through grocery stores beside people who would recoil if they knew the truth, and they did not know. This invisibility became part of his psychological reward. There is also the matter of his religious identity. Ridgway attended church consistently. He read scripture. He spoke about faith. Yet he continued killing. How does someone reconcile these contradictions? The answer lies again in compartmentalization, but also in selective belief. Ridgway reportedly believed that he could seek forgiveness privately without confessing publicly. He interpreted religious doctrine in ways that protected him from accountability. He did not internalize teachings about compassion in a way that extended to his victims. Faith became insulation rather than transformation. This selective moral application is not uncommon in individuals who maintain dual lives. They extract comforting elements of belief systems while ignoring those that demand change. Another psychological feature worth examining is his low need for novelty. Many serial offenders escalate toward increasingly elaborate acts. Ridgway did not dramatically alter methods. He did not create symbolic staging. He did not experiment widely. Why? Because his method worked. His psychological reward did not depend on innovation. It depended on repetition. Repetition created stability. Stability created confidence. Confidence sustained the cycle. This is what makes his case uniquely chilling. He was not flamboyant. He was consistent. Consistency allowed longevity. Ridgway also displayed a practical awareness of law enforcement limitations. He understood that marginalized victims generated less immediate investigative pressure. He understood that fragmented jurisdictions slowed pattern recognition. He understood that forensic science in the 1980s had limits. He did not articulate these insights academically, he absorbed them observationally. The mind of a methodical killer is not necessarily brilliant. It is observant. Ridgway watched how society responded, or failed to respond, and adjusted accordingly. There is also the question of remorse. When confronted in court years later by family members of victims, Ridgway remained mostly expressionless. He occasionally offered brief apologies, but they lacked emotional depth. His words suggested recognition of wrongdoing, but not emotional resonance. This absence of visible remorse does not always mean absence of awareness. It can indicate limited emotional capacity. Ridgway seemed to understand that what he had done was legally and socially condemned. But understanding condemnation is not the same as feeling empathy. Empathy requires imagining the suffering of others. Ridgway rarely did that. His internal focus remained self-centered, on his urges, his relief, his risk management. Another key element is his adaptability over time. When media attention surged, he reduced activity. When investigative pressure increased, he waited. When questioned by police, he cooperated calmly. This adaptability reflects patience. Patience extends survival. And survival reinforced his self-concept as untouchable. The longer he avoided capture, the more deeply entrenched his identity became. He was no longer just acting out urges, he was sustaining a secret empire of silence. The most unsettling realization may be this. Ridgway did not feel like a monster to himself, he felt like a man managing impulses. This internal normalization allowed him to function for decades without collapse. Inside his mind, there was no dramatic soundtrack, no screaming conscience, no cinematic tension. There was only quiet calculation, and quiet calculation can be more dangerous than rage, because rage burns out. Calculation endures. Chapter 7. The women no one protected, before they were statistics, before they were case numbers, before they were referred to collectively as victims of a serial killer. They were people. They laughed. They argued. They dreamed. They struggled. They mattered. The story of the Green River Killer is often told through the lens of the man who committed the crimes. But beneath that narrative lies another, far more important story. The story of the women whose lives were taken and the social conditions that left them dangerously exposed. Most of the women Gary Ridgway murdered existed on society's margins. Many were involved in sex work. Many battled addiction. Many experienced homelessness. Many had run away from abusive homes as teenagers. These circumstances did not define their worth. but they shaped how society responded to their disappearance. In the early 1980s, missing persons reports involving marginalized women often received delayed attention. Families were sometimes told to wait. Some were asked whether their loved ones had a history of running away. Others were quietly discouraged from expecting immediate action. This delay was not usually born of cruelty, it was born of systemic bias. Law enforcement agencies were overwhelmed with cases. Resources were limited, and cultural attitudes towards sex work and addiction carried stigma that influenced priorities, whether consciously or not. Predators understand these gaps. Ridgway understood them. He did not randomly select victims. He selected vulnerability. Many of the women he targeted had already experienced violence in their lives. Some had been abused as children. Some had endured violent relationships. Some lived with constant instability. They were not reckless. They were surviving. To stand on Pacific Highway South at night required courage, even if it was not labeled that way. It meant negotiating with strangers. It meant reading body language quickly. It meant calculating risk in seconds. These women were not oblivious to danger. They were intimately familiar with it. Yet familiarity does not equal immunity. Ridgway presented himself as calm, non-threatening, and transactional. In an environment where chaos was common, this demeanor stood out as safer. That perception cost lives. Families left behind were often forced to become their own investigators. Mothers walked the highway searching for familiar faces. Sisters called shelters and hospitals. Fathers posted flyers on telephone poles. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. For some families, confirmation did not come until decades later when remains were identified through advances in forensic technology. Imagine living with that uncertainty, not knowing if your daughter is alive or dead, not knowing if she is suffering, not knowing if you will ever see her again. That kind of waiting is its own form of trauma. The phrase, "the women no one protected," does not imply that no one cared. Many people cared deeply, but caring does not always translate into protection when systems fail. Protection requires timely response. Protection requires resources. Protection requires valuing all lives equally. The Green River case exposed cracks in those foundations. Another painful reality is that some victims had attempted to seek help before their deaths. Some had entered rehabilitation programs. Some had contacted social services. Some had tried to leave street life. These efforts were often undermined by limited access to long-term support. Relapse was common. Safe housing was scarce. Mental health services were stretched thin. Ridgway preyed on this instability. He targeted women who lacked protective networks, not because they were invisible, but because they were isolated. Isolation is the predator's greatest ally. Many victims also faced complicated relationships with law enforcement. Prior arrests or negative encounters created fear of police. Some avoided reporting assaults because they worried about being jailed or dismissed. This fear created silence. Silence protected Ridgway. Yet within this bleak landscape, there were acts of humanity. Some outreach workers attempted to connect women with services. Some volunteers distributed food, condoms, and harm reduction supplies. Some clergy members tried to offer counseling and shelter. These efforts saved lives. But they could not neutralize a predator operating systematically. The women Ridgway killed were not interchangeable. Each had a distinct personality. Some were described as kind. Some were described as funny. Some were stubborn. Some were shy. Some loved animals. Some loved music. Some loved their children fiercely, even when addiction complicated their ability to care for them. These details matter. They restore individuality. They resist the flattening effect of numbers. Ridgway did not see these details. He did not ask about families. He did not ask about dreams. He did not ask about pain that he saw bodies, and bodies were easier to dehumanize than people. The tragedy is not only that Ridgway killed. The tragedy is also that he was allowed to kill for so long. That longevity was not solely a function of his cunning. It was also a function of social neglect. When certain lives are treated as expendable, predators notice. When disappearances do not trigger immediate alarms, predators learn. When victims are blamed for their circumstances, predators feel justified. This does not mean society intentionally enabled Ridgway, but it does mean that systemic weaknesses created opportunity. The women deserved better. They deserved early intervention. They deserved consistent protection. They deserved to be believed. They deserved to come home. The story of the Green River Killer is incomplete without centering this truth. Because focusing only on the killer risks repeating the same mistake that allowed him to thrive, that it shifts attention away from those who suffered, and those who suffered should never be an afterthought. Grief does not move in straight lines. For the families of the women taken by Gary Ridgway, grief unfolded in fragments, in late-night phone calls, in unanswered voicemails, in birthdays that passed without celebration, in holidays where one chair remained empty. Some families spent years hoping for a knock at the door that would bring good news. Others feared that same knock because it might finally bring confirmation of the worst possibility. The uncertainty was its own punishment. When remains were discovered along the Green River or in wooded ravines near Seattle-Tacoma Airport, the process of identification could take months or even years. Decomposition, weather, and wildlife complicated forensic work. Dental records were compared. Personal effects were examined. DNA technology, still in its infancy in the 1980s, offered limited assistance. For many families, closure did not arrive until the 2000s, nearly 2 decades after their loved ones vanished. Imagine living suspended in that space. Not fully grieving because hope still flickers, not fully healing because questions remain. This prolonged uncertainty is sometimes called ambiguous loss. It freezes emotional processing. It keeps families tethered to both hope and despair at the same time. Ridgway did not witness this suffering. He did not attend funerals. He did not see mothers collapse in courtrooms. He did not hear siblings describe childhood memories through tears, but the suffering was real, and it spread outward like ripples in water. Another layer of tragedy is how many of these women had been trying, in some way, to change their circumstances. Some had entered detox programs shortly before their deaths. Some had reconnected with family. Some had expressed desire to leave street life behind. Their stories were not static. They were in motion. Ridgway froze them permanently. The courtroom years later became a space where voices finally broke through the silence that had surrounded the case. During sentencing in 2003, family members were allowed to speak directly to Ridgway. Many delivered statements filled with heartbreak, anger, and love. Some described the women not as prostitutes, but as daughters who loved to draw, sisters who babysat younger siblings, mothers who sang lullabies. These statements reclaimed identity. They rejected the narrative that vulnerability equals worthlessness. Ridgway listened quietly. His responses were brief, often mechanical. He apologized in general terms, but rarely addressed individuals specifically. His emotional distance in that room was consistent with the emotional distance that defined his crimes. Yet for families, speaking aloud mattered. It transformed silent grief into testimony. It placed the women back at the center of the story. There is another difficult truth in this chapter. Not all victims were immediately identified. Some remains discovered in the 1980s were not matched to names until decades later, when forensic technology advanced. DNA databases expanded. Techniques improved. Cold cases were reopened. Time, ironically, became an ally in delivering delayed justice. But justice delivered late is not the same as protection delivered early. The Green River case forced communities to confront uncomfortable realities about how society values different lives. Why did it take so long for urgency to match the scale of disappearance? Why were early warnings not amplified sooner? Why did stigma shape response? These questions extend beyond one case. They challenge systems. They challenge attitudes. They challenge assumptions about who deserves immediate protection. The phrase, "the women no one protected," is not an accusation against individual officers or families. It is an indictment of structural gaps, economic inequality, lack of addiction treatment access, limited mental health resources, and social stigma surrounding sex work. Ridgway moved within those gaps that he did not create them, but he exploited them relentlessly. Some of the women he killed were teenagers, some were mothers, some were barely out of childhood. Their youth underscores another layer of vulnerability. Adolescents who run away often lack identification, stable housing, and trusted adults. They are especially susceptible to manipulation. Ridgway's calm demeanor and apparent normalcy would have been particularly disarming to someone already accustomed to chaos. This manipulation was part of his method. He did not rely on brute force alone, that he relied on trust. Broken trust. In reflecting on this chapter of the story, it is important not to reduce the women to symbols of tragedy alone. They were complex individuals navigating difficult circumstances. Their involvement in sex work does not erase their humanity. Their struggles with addiction do not diminish their value. They were not disposable. They were not invisible. They were not less deserving of protection. The long delay in identifying and apprehending Ridgway intensified the pain for families. Each new body discovery reopened wounds. Each press conference reignited fear. Each rumor stirred anxiety. And yet, despite exhaustion, families persisted. They attended hearings. They spoke with reporters. They advocated for their loved ones' names to be remembered. In doing so, they resisted erasure. They ensured that the story of the Green River would not be solely about the killer. It would also be about the women, their lives, their losses, their stolen futures. The measure of a society is often reflected in how it protects its most vulnerable members. The Green River case revealed shortcomings, but it also prompted change. It forced conversations about victim advocacy, forensic preservation, and interagency cooperation. Those reforms came too late for many, but they mattered for the future. The women who were not protected in time deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in a criminal case, but as individuals whose lives carried meaning beyond the highway. Their absence is permanent. Their memory should not be. Chapter 8. Patterns Hidden in Plain Sight. Long before forensic breakthroughs finally exposed Gary Ridgway, the truth existed in fragments, scattered across reports, buried in interviews, filed away in boxes. The patterns were there. They simply had not yet formed a single, coherent picture. In the early 1980s, law enforcement agencies across King County were receiving a steady stream of information. Missing persons reports, assault complaints, tips from community members, statements from women who had survived near-fatal encounters. Each piece, on its own, appeared limited. Together, they told a story, but building that story required tools, coordination, and time that did not yet exist at the necessary level. One of the earliest patterns involved geography. Bodies were being discovered in clusters near the Green River, near Seattle-Tacoma Airport, and in wooded areas accessible from Pacific Highway south. Maps began filling with colored pins. Analysts noticed concentrations. These concentrations suggested familiarity. The killer was not randomly dumping bodies across the region, but he was using known sites repeatedly. This repetition indicated comfort. Comfort indicated local knowledge. Another pattern involved victim profiles. Most victims were young women involved in street-level sex work or experiencing homelessness. Many had last been seen along Pacific Highway South. Many had histories of addiction. Many lived unstable lives. This consistency pointed toward a targeted population. The killer was not selecting victims at random, he was selecting vulnerability. Investigators also noted similarities in cause of death, strangulation, often without severe blunt force trauma, often without evidence of prolonged struggle. This suggested a controlled attack. The killer was likely physically capable, that he likely used surprise, he likely preferred close contact. Some victims were found with clothing missing. Others were partially clothed. This suggested a sexual component. But there was little evidence of elaborate ritual, no symbols, no messages, no theatrical staging. This absence of theatrics was itself a pattern. It suggested a killer focused on outcome rather than display. Another pattern involved time. Disappearances spiked during certain periods and declined during others. Peaks often coincided with warmer months when outdoor activity increased. Winter weather sometimes slowed discovery, but not necessarily killing. This seasonal rhythm hinted at an offender whose behavior was influenced by opportunity and environment rather than internal emotional cycles alone. Yet another pattern emerged through survivor accounts. Several women described being picked up by a quiet white man driving a pickup truck. Some recalled he seemed socially awkward but not aggressive. Some recalled he talked about religion or family. Some recalled he became violent suddenly. These descriptions did not match a flamboyant predator. They matched an ordinary man. Ordinary is harder to hunt. One of the most significant patterns, though not fully appreciated at the time, involved early contact between law enforcement and Gary Ridgway. He had been interviewed, he had been polygraphed. He had been reported by a woman who accused him of attempting to strangle her. These were not small details, but in a case involving thousands of tips and suspects, they did not stand out strongly enough to override the absence of physical evidence. The system relied heavily on forensic confirmation, and forensic technology had not yet caught up to the need. Another hidden pattern involved Ridgway's routine, that he worked steady hours at a truck manufacturing plant. He lived near major transportation routes. He owned a pickup truck. He was familiar with industrial and wooded areas. These factors placed him squarely within the geographic and behavioral profile investigators were developing. But profiles are probabilities, not proof. The case also suffered from information overload. With over 10,000 suspects eventually investigated, the sheer volume of data became a barrier. Patterns can drown in noise. Detectives were not ignoring clues. They were overwhelmed by them. This distinction matters. The phrase hidden in plain sight does not imply negligence. It implies complexity. Human systems struggle when scale exceeds capacity. The Green River case exceeded capacity. There were also institutional challenges. Different police departments maintained separate records. Information sharing required manual processes. Databases were limited. Communication delays were common. A tip in one jurisdiction might not reach investigators in another for weeks or months. Patterns that spanned boundaries became harder to see. Ridgway unknowingly benefited from this fragmentation. Another pattern involved the killer's apparent restraint. He did not escalate to mass casualty events. He did not attack in public spaces. He did not use firearms. This restraint kept his crimes localized and quieter. Quiet crimes generate less immediate public panic than loud ones. Less panic means less political pressure. Less pressure means fewer emergency resources. The case remained serious, but it did not reach the level of national emergency until years later. Ridgway's lack of communication with media also reduced profile building opportunities. Without letters or calls, profilers had fewer behavioral clues to analyze. Silence can be a strategy. Another pattern emerged in hindsight: Ridgway's early passing of a polygraph. Polygraph tests are not infallible. They measure physiological responses, not truth. Individuals with certain personality traits, including emotional detachment, can sometimes pass even when lying. Ridgway's calm demeanor likely helped him. This moment of clearing him, though not official exoneration, psychologically, removed him from the center of suspicion. Once a suspect falls off the radar, returning to them requires new evidence. That evidence did not exist yet. All of these patterns existed. They simply had not yet converged. The pieces were scattered across time, space, and file cabinets, hidden in plain sight, waiting. Patterns do not announce themselves. They emerge slowly, shaped by repetition, and recognized only when someone has the ability to step back far enough to see the whole picture. For years, the Green River investigation existed in fragments. Detectives focused on individual cases because that was how the information arrived. One missing person, one body recovery, one tip at a time. The challenge was not lack of effort. The challenge was scale. One of the most important developments in the case was the growing realization that forensic evidence preserved years earlier might one day become useful. Even in the 1980s, some investigators understood that science was evolving. They carefully stored biological samples from victims, including semen, hair, and fibers. This decision would prove critical at the time. However, those samples could not definitively identify a suspect. DNA profiling existed in experimental form, but it was not yet widely available or reliable for large-scale criminal cases. The evidence waited. Another pattern involved Ridgway's own behavior after being questioned in 1982. Rather than withdrawing from risky activity, he continued killing, though sometimes with greater spacing between offenses. This suggests that being questioned did not frighten him. It reassured him. From his perspective, he had faced law enforcement directly and survived. This psychological effect is important. When offenders believe they have passed a test, their confidence increases. Confidence leads to persistence. Another subtle pattern involved Ridgway's relationships. His wives described him as controlling and emotionally distant. He had difficulty expressing affection. He often demanded sex, but struggled with intimacy. These traits align with the psychological profile of someone who seeks power rather than connection at the time. However, such domestic details were rarely prioritized in serial investigations unless accompanied by overt violence. Ridgway did not beat his spouses severely. He did not generate domestic disturbance calls that would raise red flags. His private dysfunction remained hidden. Another pattern lay in Ridgway's movement through industrial spaces. He worked in truck painting. He was comfortable around machinery, warehouses, and remote service roads. These environments overlapped with many dumping sites. This occupational familiarity did not stand out because thousands of people in the region worked similar jobs. But in hindsight, it fits. Another overlooked pattern involved the killer's apparent consistency over time. Many serial offenders escalate toward more dramatic behavior. Ridgway did not. He maintained a steady method for years. This consistency suggests a stable internal reward system. Once he found a formula that satisfied his needs, he stuck with it. Consistency can paradoxically make detection harder. When behavior does not change, it blends into the background. Another fragment involved Ridgway's religious activity. Some investigators later reflected that his church involvement might have been misinterpreted as evidence of stability. In reality, it may have functioned as camouflage. Church attendance creates a perception of moral alignment that it discourages suspicion This does not mean religious communities enable violence. It means offenders sometimes exploit assumptions about morality. Ridgway understood how he appeared. Another pattern involved his geographic anchors. He lived near many body recovery sites. He traveled predictable routes. He did not roam widely. This local focus fits the profile of an offender who kills within a comfort zone. Geographic profiling techniques existed in early forms during the 1980s, but they lacked computational support. Analysts could draw circles on maps. They could theorize, but without advanced modeling, precision was limited. The pieces were there, but they did not yet interlock. One of the most painful realizations for investigators years later was how often Ridgway's name appeared in early files. He was not an unknown. He was a known unknown. A person of interest who never crossed the threshold into prime suspect. This distinction matters. Thousands of names appear in large investigations. Only a few can receive sustained focus. Without definitive evidence, maintaining long-term surveillance on one individual is difficult to justify legally and logistically. Ridgway benefited from this reality. Another pattern involved survivor descriptions that pointed towards someone calm and ordinary. This description did not fit popular stereotypes of serial killers at the time, which leaned toward visibly unstable loners or highly dramatic personalities. Ridgway did not match those images. He matched the person. No one looks twice at. Ordinary. Patterns hidden in plain sight are often obscured by expectation. People expect monsters to look monstrous. Ridgway did not. The turning point in recognizing these patterns came not through a single revelation, but through technological evolution. As DNA analysis became more reliable in the late 1990s, investigators revisited preserved evidence. They began constructing DNA profiles from samples collected decades earlier. They compared these profiles to suspects who had been interviewed in the past. This process required patience. Records had to be digitized. Samples had to be located. Chain of custody documentation had to be verified. But slowly, the fragments began aligning. Ridgway's DNA matched semen samples from multiple victims. This was not a partial match. It was definitive. The patterns that had once existed only as probabilities now had a physical anchor. For investigators who had worked the case for years, this moment was both triumphant and devastating. Triumphant because the truth had finally surfaced. Devastating because it confirmed that the killer had been in their files all along. Hidden, but never absent. The phrase "hidden in plain sight" captures this dual reality. Ridgway did not perform extraordinary feats to avoid detection. He simply exploited ordinary systemic limitations. He existed where patterns were hardest to see. And he relied on time. Time hides many things until it reveals them. Chapter 9. A City on Edge. Fear rarely arrives all at once. It seeps in. It settles. It changes behavior quietly before people realize how much has shifted. In King County during the early 1980s, fear did not explode in a sudden mass panic. Instead, it spread gradually, carried by rumors, news reports, and whispered warnings. At first, residents heard about a body found near the river. Then another. Then another. The stories accumulated, and with them, a new awareness took shape. Something was happening. Parents began giving different instructions to their children. Women started paying closer attention to who stood behind them in line at convenience stores. People locked doors more carefully at night. The Green River was no longer just a river. It was a warning. The media played a complicated role in shaping this atmosphere. Newspapers ran headlines about multiple women found strangled. Television news aired helicopter footage of search teams combing wooded areas. Reporters spoke of a possible serial killer, but early coverage often focused on numbers rather than narratives. another body found, another victim identified, another press conference. This repetition created a strange effect that on one hand, it heightened awareness that on the other, it risked numbing the public. Tragedy repeated too often can become abstract. For communities directly connected to Pacific Highway South, however, the fear was anything but abstract. Motel owners noticed fewer customers late at night. Some businesses closed earlier. Truck drivers talked about the case at rest stops. Women working the corridor began altering routines as much as they could. Some refused to get into vehicles with only one occupant. Some worked closer to well-lit areas. Some tried to memorize license plate numbers. But fear does not erase economic reality. People still needed money. People still needed shelter. The city's anxiety took on a layered quality. There was fear of an unknown killer. There was frustration with the lack of an arrest. There was anger about the perceived low priority given to the victims. And there was a growing sense that the problem was bigger than any single neighborhood. Community meetings were held. Residents asked police hard questions. Why hadn't anyone been caught? Why did the killings continue? What were police doing differently now? Law enforcement officials emphasized the size of the task force, the number of interviews conducted, and the challenges of the case. They asked for public assistance. They encouraged people to report suspicious activity, yet reassurance only went so far. The killer was still out there. This unresolved threat changes how people experience daily life. Routine interactions begin to feel charged. That a passing truck becomes suspicious. The stranger's glance feels heavier. Silence at night feels louder. The phrase, "a city on edge," captures this cumulative tension. It is not hysteria. It is hyper-awareness. In many ways, the fear was unevenly distributed. Middle-class neighborhoods farther from the highway felt the danger in theory. Communities near Pacific Highway South felt it in practice. This disparity mirrored broader social divides. Those closest to the victims lived with the most immediate risk, and often with the least protection. Another dimension of the city's anxiety involved trust. Trust in law enforcement, trust in institutions. Trust in the idea that someone would step in and stop this. That as years passed without an arrest, some residents began to question whether the system was capable of catching the killer at all. This erosion of trust can be corrosive. It creates a sense of abandonment. Some people turned inward. They relied on personal safety strategies rather than institutional ones. They avoided certain areas. They limited nighttime activity. They carried personal protection devices. The city adapted to danger. Adaptation, however, is not the same as resolution. It is survival in uncertainty. The media occasionally speculated about the killer's identity. Profiles were published. Experts described what kind of person might be responsible. Viewers were invited to consider whether someone they knew fit the description. This created an uncomfortable atmosphere. People began looking at neighbors differently. Co-workers. Acquaintances. The idea that the killer could be an ordinary man living an ordinary life unsettled many. Monsters were supposed to look monstrous. The suggestion that one could blend and challenged that assumption. The city's edge was not only about fear of being attacked. It was about fear of misjudgment. Who can you trust? Who might be hiding something? These questions lingered without answers. For families of victims, the city's edge felt personal. They lived in a world where time had split into before and after, before disappearance, after disappearance. Every news update reopened wounds. Every rumor sparked hope or dread. They watched as years passed and faces in press photos aged. Children of victims grew up. Parents grew older. The killer remained unknown. This prolonged uncertainty created a different kind of fear. Not the fear of immediate harm, but the fear that justice might never come. The city held its breath, not dramatically, but persistently. Day after day, year after year, the edge became a permanent feature of the emotional landscape. As the years progressed, the tension in King County did not fade. It settled into something heavier. The early shock of multiple body discoveries evolved into a sustained, uneasy vigilance. Residents no longer reacted with surprise when remains were found in wooded areas. Instead, there was a grim recognition. Another one. Another family changed forever. This normalization of tragedy created a complicated emotional climate. Fear was no longer sharp and immediate. It was chronic. Chronic fear alters communities in subtle ways. It shifts routines. It erodes trust. It creates a quiet, persistent stress that lingers even on calm days. Law enforcement faced mounting pressure. The Green River Task Force grew in size and cost. By the mid-1980s, it had become one of the largest serial killer investigations in American history at that time. Detectives worked long hours. Files filled rooms. Thousands of names were entered into databases. Polygraphs were administered. Surveillance operations were launched. The public knew resources were being spent, but results remained elusive. In press conferences, officials spoke carefully. They emphasized progress without promising imminent arrest. They acknowledged the suffering of families. They asked for patience. Patience is difficult when fear is constant. For the women still working along Pacific Highway South, the city's tension felt deeply personal. Some described scanning every passing vehicle with heightened suspicion. Some developed informal codes to warn one another about dangerous clients. Others withdrew entirely from street-level work if they had alternative options, but many had no alternatives. The killers' continued freedom forced impossible calculations. Risk was weighed against survival every night. In middle-class neighborhoods farther from the highway, the case was discussed at dinner tables and workplaces. Parents debated whether to let teenagers attend late-night events. Some avoided wooded parks. Some changed jogging routes. The sense of vulnerability extended beyond the original victim group. Serial killers disrupt assumptions about safety. They make randomness feel possible. Another layer of the city's anxiety involved media representation. National attention occasionally surged when new clusters of bodies were discovered. Crime shows and newspapers began referring to the Green River Killer as potentially one of the most prolific in American history. This label both amplified fear and complicated understanding. Prolific suggested scale. Scale suggested a threat beyond ordinary criminality. Yet the absence of a face kept the threat abstract. The killer became an idea, an invisible presence. People imagined him as monstrous, perhaps visibly disturbed, perhaps socially isolated. Few imagined a quiet, middle-aged man, attending church and going to work daily. The gap between imagination and reality protected Ridgway, while the city wrestled with fear. He continued his routine. He clocked in at Kenworth, that he attended services, that he maintained relationships, that he followed news reports. He observed the tension he had created. One of the most disturbing aspects of this period is the possibility that Ridgway drove through neighborhoods gripped by anxiety, fully aware that he was the source. The power of secrecy is magnified. When it affects thousands, he did not write letters to the press. He did not call police. That he did not taunt. His silence was part of the control. Without communication, investigators lacked behavioral clues. Without dramatic escalation, public urgency plateaued. The case remained active, but it no longer dominated headlines daily. This shift illustrates a harsh truth about prolonged investigations. Attention fluctuates. News cycles move on. New crises emerge. But for families, nothing moved on. They marked anniversaries alone. They visited grave sites. When they existed, they lived in a city that sometimes seemed to adapt to horror rather than resolve it. the psychological weight of an unsolved serial case can linger for decades. It shapes identity. It becomes part of regional memory. People who grew up during that time remember warnings from parents, altered routines, and whispered conversations about the Green River. The river itself became symbolic. What once represented nature and industry now carried an association with death. Some residents avoided it entirely. Others felt uneasy passing bridges at night. Landscapes can absorb stories. King County's landscape absorbed this one deeply. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the frequency of body discoveries declined. Whether this reflected a true reduction in killings or simply the passage of time and concealment was unclear. Some believed the killer had moved. Others speculated he had died. But the case never officially closed. Files remained open. Evidence remained stored. The task force, though reduced in size, continued working leads. The city remained on edge. Even if the edge had dulled, it is important to understand that the city's fear was not only about physical danger, it was about unanswered questions. How could someone do this for so long? How could he avoid detection? Was he someone we know? These questions erode a community's sense of predictability. Predictability is comfort. When predictability disappears, so does ease. For nearly 2 decades, King County carried this unresolved tension. Children grew up hearing about the Green River Killer as a cautionary tale. Teenagers absorbed warnings about strangers in trucks. Adults checked locks twice. The killer's invisibility had reshaped the city's psychology, and yet, hidden within evidence rooms and aging case files, the answer waited. Science was evolving. Technology was catching up. The city did not yet know that the edge it had lived on for so long was nearing its turning point. But the moment was coming, quietly, just as the fear had once arrived. Chapter 10. The Man Who Almost Got Away. If the story of the Green River Killer had unfolded only a few years earlier, it might have ended without a name. If it had unfolded a few years later, it might have ended much sooner. Gary Ridgway existed in a narrow window of time, a period when forensic science was advancing but not yet powerful enough to catch him immediately. That window allowed him to operate for nearly 2 decades. He did not escape because he was invisible. He escaped because the tools needed to see him clearly had not yet fully formed. In the early years of the investigation, Ridgway had already drawn police attention. He lived near the crime scenes. He drove a pickup truck. He had been accused of choking a sex worker in a previous incident. In 1982, he voluntarily met with detectives. He answered questions calmly. He allowed them to search his home and vehicle. And then he passed a polygraph. At the time, polygraphs carried weight. While not definitive proof of innocence, they often influenced investigative direction. Ridgway's calm demeanor worked in his favor. He did not appear agitated. He did not contradict himself dramatically. He walked away. This moment cannot be overstated. It was not a declaration of innocence, but it was a turning point. When investigators are faced with thousands of leads, they must prioritize. Ridgway's file remained in the system, but it did not dominate attention. He blended back into ordinary life. Through the mid-1980s and 1990s, the killings appeared to slow. Bodies continued to be discovered, but not with the same intensity as the early years. Some investigators theorized the killer had been incarcerated for another crime. Others speculated he had moved out of state. Ridgway had done neither. He had simply reduced frequency. This reduction may have been strategic. It may have been psychological. It may have reflected changes in his personal life, including relationships that temporarily stabilized his routine. But he never stopped completely. What makes Ridgway's case especially unsettling is how close he remained to law enforcement attention without triggering arrest. His name resurfaced periodically. Detectives reviewed old suspects. Files were reopened. Interviews were re-examined. Yet without conclusive physical evidence, suspicion could not transform into prosecution. The evidence that might have secured conviction in the 1980s existed, but only in preserved biological samples that science could not yet interpret fully. Those samples waited. Ridgway continued working at the Kenworth truck factory. He was considered reliable. He married again. Neighbors described him as quiet but unremarkable. He attended church. He engaged in community life in small, routine ways. The most chilling aspect of this period is its normalcy. Ridgway did not display erratic behavior that would alert others. He did not commit public acts of violence unrelated to his pattern. He did not boast or confide in acquaintances. He carried his secret privately. The man who almost got away succeeded for so long because he did not seek recognition. He sought continuation. Another factor that nearly secured his escape was investigative exhaustion. Large-scale serial investigations can span years, draining resources and morale. Detectives retire. Personnel change. Institutional memory fades. Ridgway benefited from time. Time disperses urgency. Time reshuffles priorities. Time complicates recollection. That be why the late 1990s, the Green River case had entered a colder phase. It was not forgotten, but it was no longer dominating headlines. Advances in technology, however, were quietly reshaping investigative possibilities. That DNA profiling had matured significantly. Laboratories could now extract genetic markers from older samples with greater reliability. Databases were expanding. Techniques were becoming more precise. Investigators revisited preserved evidence from the early 1980s. They began testing semen samples collected from several victims. The results generated DNA profiles. Now they needed comparisons. That Ridgway's name re-entered focus through geographic profiling and renewed suspect review. Investigators noted his proximity to dumping sites. They noted his early contact with police. They noted prior accusations of strangulation. Surveillance was initiated. Undercover officers followed him discreetly. They observed his routine. They collected items he discarded, including a cup and cigarette butts. These items contained DNA. In 2001, the comparison was made. The DNA from Ridgway matched semen samples from multiple Green River victims. After nearly 20 years, the pattern had a name. Ridgway was arrested in November 2001. For many in King County, the news felt surreal. The killer had been among them the entire time that he had worked, he had shopped, he had attended church. He had nearly succeeded in carrying his secret to the grave. The phrase "almost got away" is not hyperbole. Without preserved evidence, without advancing technology, without renewed review, the case might have remained unsolved indefinitely. Ridgway's longevity was not due to brilliance alone. It was due to timing. He committed crimes in an era where DNA science was emerging but not yet decisive. He stopped before the digital age of widespread surveillance. He operated within systemic gaps that would later narrow, but for nearly 2 decades, those gaps protected him. The man who almost got away had lived undetected long enough to believe he truly might, and then science caught up. When Gary Ridgway was arrested on November 30th, 2001, the moment felt both sudden and long overdue. For nearly 20 years, he had existed as a shadow within an open investigation. His name had floated through reports. His face had been seen by detectives. His truck had been examined. He had even sat across from investigators and answered questions. And still, he had walked free. The arrest did not come from a dramatic confession or a witness stepping forward with new testimony. It came quietly, through laboratory analysis and patient evidence comparison. The DNA profile created from preserved samples matched Ridgway's genetic material with statistical certainty. Science, not luck, closed the gap. When police took him into custody, Ridgway did not resist dramatically. There were no violent outbursts, no public spectacle. He was processed calmly. The image of him being led away in handcuffs contrasted sharply with the enormity of the crimes he was suspected of committing. The public reaction was immediate. News outlets across the country reported that the Green River Killer had finally been identified. For families who had waited years for answers, the arrest felt like a release of breath long held. There was relief. There was anger. There was disbelief. How could this man, this quiet truck painter, have done so much harm for so long? That question lingered heavily. Investigators soon confronted Ridgway with the DNA evidence. Faced with scientific confirmation, he began to talk. What followed stunned even seasoned detectives. Ridgway confessed not only to the murders linked through DNA, but to dozens more. He described picking up women along Pacific Highway South, driving them to secluded locations, strangling them, and disposing of their bodies in wooded areas he knew well. That he spoke without theatrical emotion. He did not deny, he did not deflect. He described matter-of-factly. This matter-of-fact tone deeply unsettled those who listened. There was no dramatic villainy, no grand narrative, just routine descriptions of repeated killing. One of the most shocking aspects of his confession was the scale. Ridgway claimed responsibility for more than 70 murders. While not all could be conclusively verified, he ultimately pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder, making him one of the most prolific confirmed serial killers in United States history. The man who almost got away had, in many ways, succeeded for years beyond what investigators imagined possible. But there was another layer to his confession that mattered strategically. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to provide information about the locations of victims, whose remains had not yet been recovered. This agreement allowed detectives to revisit wooded areas with him present, guiding them through terrain he had navigated alone decades earlier. These recovery missions were somber and painstaking. Ridgway walked investigators through forests, pointing to general areas where he believed he had left bodies. Time had altered landscapes. Trees had grown. Paths had changed. Memory had blurred. But in some cases, remains were found. Families who had endured decades of uncertainty received answers. Delayed, painful, but answers. For the community, the arrest reshaped memory. The fear that had once been abstract now had a face. The city that had lived on edge for years could finally name the source. Yet closure is complicated. An arrest does not undo loss, that a confession does not restore stolen years. For some families, hearing details of how their loved ones died intensified grief rather than soothing it. Ridgway's sentencing in 2003 became a public reckoning. He stood in court while family members delivered impact statements. Many addressed him directly. Some expressed rage. Some expressed heartbreak. Some expressed forgiveness grounded in personal faith. Ridgway listened quietly. His responses were minimal. He apologized generally, but did not display deep emotion. The courtroom became a space where silence broke, where voices long muted by uncertainty finally spoke in full force. The man who almost got away had been stopped, but the cost of that near escape was enormous. The case also forced broader reflection on investigative systems. Law enforcement agencies examined how information sharing had been handled. They reviewed the use of polygraphs. They studied how forensic evidence had been preserved and eventually utilized. The Green River case became a reference point in discussions about cold case management and DNA preservation. That Ridgway's longevity demonstrated both the limitations and eventual power of evolving science. Had biological samples not been carefully stored in the 1980s, there might have been no DNA comparison in 2001 that had investigators not revisited old suspects. His name might have remained buried in files. The difference between unsolved and solved sometimes lies in patience that Ridgway's story underscores a sobering reality. Some offenders operate effectively not because they are criminal masterminds, but because systems are imperfect. He exploited those imperfections. He nearly outran accountability, but he did not outrun time. The man who almost got away is now serving life in prison without the possibility of parole that he will never leave. Yet the fact that he came so close to permanent anonymity remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, because it reminds us that evil does not always collapse under its own weight. Sometimes it must be uncovered deliberately, piece by piece, evidence by evidence, until the truth can no longer hide. Chapter 11. The Long Road of Investigation. Long before DNA delivered clarity, the Green River investigation existed as a vast, grinding effort defined by endurance. That IT was not one dramatic chase. IT was thousands of small steps, thousands of interviews, thousands of hours, thousands of decisions made under uncertainty. From the earliest days, detectives understood they were confronting something unprecedented in scale. Bodies were being discovered faster than they could process leads. Tips flooded in from the public. Every missing person report had to be evaluated for potential connection. The investigation quickly outgrew traditional case management. That a dedicated task force was formed, drawing personnel from multiple agencies. This collaboration was necessary, but it also introduced complexity. Different departments had different protocols, different record-keeping systems, different priorities. Coordinating all of this required constant communication, and communication, in the pre-digital era, was slow. Files were physical, photos were printed, maps were drawn by hand. Information moved through memos, phone calls, and meetings. Each step took time. One of the earliest strategies involved building a victimology profile. Detectives analyzed who the victims were, where they were last seen, and what circumstances surrounded their disappearances. Patterns emerged. Young women, often involved in street-level sex work, often last seen along Pacific Highway South, often found in wooded or river-adjacent areas. This profile guided patrol strategies and undercover operations. Officers posed as sex workers along the highway, attempting to attract the killer's attention. They hoped he might approach, but Ridgway was cautious that he did not pick up women who looked unfamiliar to him in that environment. Undercover officers often stood unnoticed. Another major investigative avenue involved suspect screening. Anyone fitting partial descriptions and frequenting the area could be questioned. Truck drivers, motel guests, local residents, men reported by sex workers, men with prior assault records. This screening process ballooned. Over 10,000 individuals were eventually interviewed. Each interview required documentation. Each required follow-up. Each generated new potential leads. Most went nowhere. The sheer volume created a logistical nightmare. Detectives also attempted geographic profiling. They mapped body recovery sites and attempted to identify a central comfort zone where the killer might live or work. Early geographic profiling techniques were rudimentary. Analysts could draw overlapping circles and look for convergence areas. These methods suggested the killer likely lived in or near South King County. Gary Ridgway lived in South King County, but so did hundreds of thousands of others. Geographic profiling narrowed the field. It did not isolate a single person. Another investigative approach involved forensic analysis. Fibers from victims' clothing were compared to carpet fibers from suspects' homes and vehicles. Paint chips were analyzed, hair samples, were examined under microscopes. Blood typing was performed. These methods could exclude suspects. They rarely conclusively identified the killer's reliance on strangulation rather than stabbing or shooting also limited ballistic or tool mark evidence. There was no unique weapon to trace. The investigation thus relied heavily on circumstantial and testimonial evidence. This placed enormous weight on witness credibility. Survivor accounts became particularly important. Women who had been assaulted or nearly killed provided descriptions. Some recalled pickup trucks. Some recalled religious talk. Some recalled being choked. These details informed composite sketches, but sketches varied. Memory is imperfect, especially after trauma. Ridgway benefited from this variability. Another challenge was managing public expectations. The task force had to balance transparency with investigative integrity. Releasing too much information could compromise strategies. Releasing too little could erode trust. This tension played out in press conferences and media interviews. Officials emphasized progress, but they could not promise timelines. Inside the task force, morale fluctuated. Detectives confronted scenes of extreme violence. They met grieving families. They worked long hours with little visible success. Burnout became a real risk. Some investigators later described the case as emotionally consuming. Yet they persisted. One of the most important long-term decisions made during this period was evidence preservation. Even when forensic technology could not yet fully analyze certain samples, investigators stored them carefully. Semen samples, hair, fibers, clothing. These items were cataloged and retained. This decision reflected foresight. IT acknowledged that science evolves, that future tools might extract meaning from what current tools could not. This preservation effort required funding and discipline. In some jurisdictions, evidence from old cases is discarded due to space limitations. The Green River Task Force did not do that. They kept the evidence. They kept the possibility alive. Another part of the long road involved revisiting old suspects periodically. As years passed, detectives re-examined files. They looked for patterns they might have missed. They compared notes. They re-interviewed individuals. Gary Ridgway's name surfaced again and again, but without new evidence. He remained one among many. The investigation was not stagnant. It was slow. Slow does not mean inactive. It means incremental. Each year added small pieces. Each decade brought new tools. The long road of investigation was less like a sprint and more like a slow, exhausting march, and marches test endurance. As the 1990s unfolded, the Green River investigation entered a new phase, one defined less by frantic searching and more by strategic waiting. Waiting for technology, waiting for breakthroughs, waiting for something that could cut through decades of uncertainty. By this point, the task force had been reduced in size, but the case was never closed. It lived in files, in evidence rooms, and in the memories of detectives who had dedicated years of their lives to it. Some retired, some moved to other assignments. But the case remained. One of the most important shifts during this period was the increasing emphasis on cold case methodology. Law enforcement agencies across the country began recognizing that unsolved cases could benefit from periodic systematic review rather than indefinite dormancy. The Green River case became a prime candidate for this approach. Investigators revisited evidence inventories. They checked chain of custody documentation. They identified which samples might be suitable for emerging DNA analysis techniques. This process was meticulous. Evidence collected in the early 1980s had been stored using standards of that era. Packaging methods, labeling conventions, and storage conditions varied. Some samples were degraded. Some were incomplete, but some were viable. laboratories began extracting genetic profiles from preserved biological material. This was not instant. Early DNA testing was expensive, time-consuming, and technically demanding. Each sample required careful handling. But gradually, profiles were built. The next challenge was comparison. DNA profiles are only useful if there is something to compare them against. In the late 1990s, national and state DNA databases were expanding. Laws were enacted requiring DNA samples from certain categories of offenders. Gary Ridgway had prior arrests and interactions with law enforcement, but he had not been convicted of crimes that automatically placed his DNA in databases. This meant investigators needed a different approach. They returned to old suspect lists. They prioritized individuals who had been interviewed early, lived near crime scenes, and matched general profiles. Ridgway's name resurfaced. Again, this time, investigators decided to take a more proactive approach. They initiated covert surveillance. Detectives followed Ridgway discreetly. They observed his routines. They waited for opportunities to collect discarded items that might contain DNA. A cup thrown away at a restaurant, a cigarette, but discarded in public. These items became potential keys. This technique, known as surreptitious DNA collection, operates within legal frameworks in many jurisdictions because discarded items are considered abandoned property. It is a quiet, patient method, fitting for a case defined by patience. When Ridgway's discarded DNA was collected, it was sent to a laboratory for comparison with profiles developed from victims. The wait for results was tense. Years of effort had funneled into this moment. When the results came back, they were clear. The DNA matched. Not just one sample, multiple samples. The probability of coincidence was astronomically low. After nearly 20 years, the investigation had crossed the threshold from suspicion to proof. For detectives who had worked the case for decades, this moment carried mixed emotions. There was relief. There was vindication. There was sorrow. Relief that the killer had been identified. Vindication that their long efforts had not been in vain. Sorrow for the years lost. The arrest of Gary Ridgway in 2001 did not mark the end of the investigation. It marked the beginning of a new phase. Now detectives had to corroborate confessions, locate additional victims, and build a prosecutable case that could withstand legal scrutiny. Ridgway's cooperation became a strategic tool that he agreed to guide investigators to potential burial sites. These searches were physically and emotionally taxing. Forests had changed. Landscapes had been developed. Some areas were now residential. Others had been altered by natural processes. Memory after decades is imperfect, but in some cases, remains were recovered. Each recovery required careful forensic processing. Each identification required notification of families. The investigation, though transformed, continued. Another part of this phase involved reviewing how the case had been handled. Internal assessments examined what worked and what did not. These reviews were not about assigning blame. They were about learning. The Green River case influenced changes in how large-scale serial investigations are managed. It underscored the importance of evidence preservation. It highlighted the limitations of polygraphs. It emphasized the need for interagency information sharing. It demonstrated the power of revisiting cold cases with new technology. The long road of investigation did not end with an arrest. It extended into institutional memory. It became a case studied, a cautionary tale, and a testament to persistence. For families, the road was even longer. Some received answers. Some received remains. Some received only confirmation of death without recovery. Grief does not resolve neatly with a conviction, but knowledge can replace uncertainty, and sometimes knowledge is the only form of closure available. The Green River investigation stands as an example of what happens when patience intersects with progress. That IT shows that some truths cannot be forced. They must be waited for. And when they arrive, they reshape everything. Chapter 12. Breakthrough after 2 decades. For nearly 20 years, the Green River case existed in a strange state of suspension. That IT was never forgotten. But it was never solved. That IT lingered in evidence rooms, in aging file cabinets, in the memories of detectives who carried fragments of faces and names they could not release. The idea of a breakthrough became something people spoke about cautiously, almost superstitiously. Hope had been raised too many times before to be why the late 1990s. However, the foundations for a genuine breakthrough were quietly forming. Not through dramatic revelations, not through sudden confessions, but through steady scientific progress. The DNA analysis, once experimental, had matured into a powerful investigative tool. Laboratories could now generate reliable genetic profiles from small or degraded samples. Databases were expanding. Techniques for comparison were improving. The future was catching up to the past. Investigators returned to the Green River evidence with new eyes. They carefully reviewed preserved biological samples collected from victims in the early 1980s. These samples had been stored with the hope that one day, science might reveal what investigators could not. That day was approaching. Technicians began extracting DNA profiles from semen samples associated with several victims. Each successful extraction felt like a small victory. But profiles alone were not enough. They needed a match. The process of identifying potential suspects for comparison was meticulous. Investigators prioritized individuals who had appeared in early files, lived near the dumping sites, and matched behavioral profiles developed over the years. Gary Ridgway's name reemerged, not dramatically, not as a revelation, but as a familiar entry in a long list. He had been interviewed, he had been polygraphed, he had been reported by a sex worker who accused him of choking her. He lived near multiple body recovery sites. These facts, taken together, warranted renewed attention. Surveillance began. Quietly, detectives observed Ridgway's routines. They noted his movements. They waited for an opportunity to collect a DNA sample without alerting him. This phase required patience. Ridgway was not careless. He did not leave obvious items behind regularly. But eventually, investigators obtained discarded objects containing his DNA. These items were sent to the laboratory. The comparison process was slow and deliberate. Analysts followed strict protocols. Contamination had to be ruled out. Results had to be confirmed independently. When the first match appeared, it was treated with cautious optimism. Point one match could be a laboratory error, but additional matches followed. The DNA from Ridgway matched samples from multiple victims. The statistical probability of coincidence was effectively zeroed. That the breakthrough was real for detectives who had spent years on the case. The moment carried a surreal quality. The name they had seen in files for decades now had a scientific anchor. Gary Ridgway was no longer a possibility, he was the suspect. The arrest plan was executed quietly. There were no public announcements beforehand and no dramatic buildup. Police took Ridgway into custody on November 30th, 2001, when he was informed of the DNA evidence. His response was not explosive. He did not protest loudly. That he did not deny that he listened. This reaction in itself was telling. Individuals confronted with false accusations often react with shock, anger, or confusion. Ridgway's calm suggested awareness that he knew what the evidence meant. The breakthrough did not end with the arrest. It opened the door to a second phase of revelation. Investigators wanted to know how many victims there were. They wanted to know where bodies might be located. They wanted to know details that only the killer could provide. Ridgway began to talk. His confessions were methodical. He described picking up women along Pacific Highway South. He described driving them to secluded locations. He described strangling them. He described dumping their bodies in wooded areas. He often could not remember names. He sometimes confused dates. But the general pattern was consistent. The scale of his admissions stunned investigators. He claimed responsibility for far more murders than had been officially attributed to the Green River Killer. This raised difficult questions. How many victims would never be found? How many families would never receive confirmation? The breakthrough after 2 decades brought answers, but it also brought new forms of pain. Truth can hurt, especially when it confirms the worst fears. The Green River case had entered its final chapter, but it would not be a simple ending. Once Gary Ridgway began confessing, the scope of the Green River case expanded beyond what even the most seasoned investigators had anticipated. Each confession added weight. Each admission stretched the boundaries of what had once seemed imaginable. Ridgway did not present his story as a dramatic narrative. He spoke in fragments, short sentences, simple descriptions. He described murder as though recalling routine tasks. This manner of speaking deeply unsettled those in the room. There was no visible emotional struggle, no shaking, no tears. Only matter-of-fact recollection. Investigators quickly realized that verifying Ridgway's statements would be essential. Confessions alone, even detailed ones, are not sufficient for prosecution. They needed corroboration. They began cross-referencing his statements with known missing persons cases. They compared his descriptions of clothing, locations, and circumstances with existing records that in many cases, the details aligned. Ridgway also agreed, as part of a plea negotiation, to assist in locating burial sites. This cooperation was strategic. Prosecutors sought to avoid a prolonged trial that would re-traumatize families and risk unpredictable outcomes in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Ridgway agreed to plead guilty and provide information about victims whose remains had not been recovered. This decision was controversial. Some families wanted a death sentence. Others prioritized recovery and identification. The legal system sought a balance between punishment and information. Ridgway was transported to wooded areas under heavy guard. He pointed to approximate locations where he believed he had left bodies. Time had transformed these landscapes. Trees had grown. Roads had shifted. Some areas had been developed. Memory after decades is imperfect, but in several cases, search teams recovered human remains. Each recovery initiated a complex forensic process. Bones were examined, DNA profiles were generated. Comparisons were made with missing persons databases. When identifications were achieved, families were notified. These notifications were both devastating and relieving. Devastating because they confirmed death, relieving because uncertainty ended. The breakthrough after 2 decades was not a single moment. It was a cascade. Arrest, confession, recovery, identification, plea, sentencing. Each step carried emotional weight. In 2003, Ridgway formally pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with family members. Some held photographs, some clutched tissues, some stared at Ridgway silently. Impact statements were delivered, stories were told, names were spoken aloud. For many families, this was the first time their loved ones' stories were heard publicly. The breakthrough had finally given voice to decades of silence. Yet, even with conviction, questions remained. Ridgway claimed more victims than those he pleaded guilty to killing. Some remains may never be found. Some identities may never be confirmed. The full scope of his crimes may never be known. This uncertainty is one of the lingering shadows of the case. The breakthrough also forced reflection within law enforcement. Investigators acknowledged that had DNA technology existed earlier, Ridgway would likely have been caught much sooner. This realization is painful, but it is also instructive that IT highlights the importance of evidence. Preservation.it underscores the value of cold case review.it demonstrates the power of patience combined with technological progress. The Green River case became a benchmark that IT showed what is possible when old evidence meets new science. IT also showed the human cost of waiting. For families, the breakthrough did not mark the end of grief. Grief does not end. But it transformed that IT shifted from ambiguous loss to confirmed loss, from endless waiting to permanent mourning. Some families found a measure of peace in knowing the truth. Others struggled with anger that justice had come so late. Both reactions are valid. The breakthrough after 2 decades was a triumph of persistence that IT was also a reminder. Some truths take time. But time does not erase responsibility that IT only delays accountability. Chapter 13. Confession of a Monster. Confessions are often imagined as emotional outpourings. Tears, regret, breakdowns. Gary Ridgway's confessions were nothing like that. They were quiet, measured, devoid of drama. This absence of emotion made them more disturbing, not less. When Ridgway began speaking in detail about his crimes, investigators expected resistance, bargaining, or attempts to minimize responsibility. Instead, they encountered a man who described murder as though recounting routine tasks at work. Pick up, drive, strangle, dump, repeat. These were the verbs that structured his recollections. He did not frame his actions as tragic mistakes. He did not portray himself as misunderstood. He presented himself as someone explaining a pattern. This tone forced detectives to confront a deeply unsettling reality. Ridgway was not confessing to relieve guilt. He was confessing because he had been caught. The difference matters that in psychological terms. Remorse involves recognition of another person's suffering that Ridgway's language rarely acknowledged suffering, that he focused on his actions, not their impact. When asked why he killed, Ridgway offered simple explanations that he said he wanted to kill sex workers because he believed they were bad. He said he wanted to get rid of witnesses that he said he felt urges and acted on them. These statements lack nuance. They reveal a black and white worldview. People were either acceptable or disposable. There was no middle ground point. One of the most chilling aspects of his confessions was his admission that he sometimes revisited dumping sites to engage in sexual acts with the bodies. He described these visits without visible shame. For investigators, this detail confirmed that murder itself was only part of his gratification cycle. The true reward was extended control, ownership, possession. This behavior places Ridgway within a subset of offenders who derive ongoing satisfaction from their crimes long after death. The act of killing opens the door. The control continues. Ridgway also admitted that he had difficulty remembering many victims. He explained that the killings blurred together. This blurring is significant that IT indicates that each murder did not stand out emotionally. They were not unique events. In his mind, they were iterations. Repetition erodes distinction. This reinforces the idea that killing had become normalized within his psychological framework. Investigators attempted to extract as much detail as possible from Ridgway's memory. They asked about locations. They asked about clothing. They asked about personal items. Sometimes he could recall specific details. Sometimes he could not. Memory decay over decades is real, but so is selective memory. Ridgway may have avoided recalling details that carried emotional weight, or he may simply never encoded them strongly in the first place. Both possibilities are disturbing. Another aspect of Ridgway's confessions involved his perception of law enforcement. that he admitted that passing the polygraph early in the investigation made him feel safe. He believed he had beaten the system. This belief increased his confidence that IT encouraged continuation. He also admitted that he paid attention to news coverage. He watched reports about the Green River Killer, that he followed discussions about suspects, that he adjusted behavior based on what he learned. This demonstrates an awareness of the investigation. He was not detached from it. He was monitoring it. In this sense, his confessions revealed that he had been psychologically present throughout the entire hunt. He was both hunter and observer. Another chilling detail involved his explanation of why he chose certain dumping sites. He said he picked places that were easy to reach but unlikely to be visited by others, that he preferred wooded areas with thick brush. He preferred locations near roads he traveled often. Convenience mattered. Again, simplicity. He did not romanticize these choices. He framed them as practical. Practicality stripped murder of moral gravity in his mind. When confronted with the number of victims, Ridgway acknowledged that he did not know the exact count that he guessed. This guessing itself is disturbing. That it implies a level of detachment where individual lives were not tracked. They were not tallied. They were not cataloged. They were consumed and forgotten. Investigators also explored Ridgway's religious beliefs during confessions. He spoke about praying. He spoke about asking God for forgiveness. He did not see this as contradictory to his actions. This selective morality underscores his compartmentalization. In his mind, forgiveness was accessible without repentance in the traditional sense. This belief insulated him from self-condemnation. The confessions did not present a monster roaring about dominance. They presented a man describing routine, and routine is perhaps the most frightening context in which evil can exist. As Gary Ridgway continued to speak, investigators became aware that they were not simply documenting crimes. They were documenting a worldview built on detachment, entitlement, and self-justification. Ridgway did not present himself as a tragic figure. He did not blame his parents. That he did not blame society. He did not claim to be driven by voices or delusions. That he framed his actions as choices. This is important. Many people search for explanations that transform killers into victims of circumstance. Ridgway's confessions resist that narrative. He acknowledged knowing that what he was doing was wrong according to the law, that he simply did not care. This admission strips away comforting illusions. That it suggests that some individuals fully understand societal rules and still choose to violate them repeatedly. Another disturbing feature of Ridgway's confessions was his description of control. That he spoke about liking the moment when victims stopped resisting. He spoke about feeling powerful, not in a grandiose way, in a quiet way. This aligns with the pattern seen throughout his crimes. He did not seek chaos. He sought submission. Submission resolved his internal sense of inadequacy. Strangulation was not only a method. It was a symbol. Hands around a neck represent direct, physical dominance. It is intimate. It leaves no distance between perpetrator and victim. Ridgway chose this method because it maximized his sense of control. During questioning, investigators attempted to probe Ridgway's emotional life. They asked about guilt. They asked about fear. They asked about remorse. His answers were minimal. He acknowledged feeling bad sometimes. But he did not elaborate. That he did not describe emotional suffering. That he did not describe nightmares. He did not describe intrusive memories. This emotional flatness is consistent with what psychologists describe as shallow affect. It does not mean absence of all emotion. It means limited emotional depth. Ridgway appeared capable of basic feelings, irritation, satisfaction, mild sadness, but not deep empathy. Another notable element was his inability to articulate complex inner experiences. When asked why he felt urges, he could not explain beyond simple statements like, "I just wanted to." This simplicity may reflect limited introspective ability. He did not analyze himself. He did not explore motives deeply that he operated. This lack of introspection is dangerous because it prevents self-regulation. People who cannot examine their own behavior meaningfully are less likely to change. That Ridgway's confessions also shed light on how he maintained his double life. He explained that he tried not to think about killings when he was at work or at home, that he mentally put them away. This confirms long-standing theories about his compartmentalization. The mind, when trained to separate experiences, can maintain contradictory identities. Ridgway was not constantly haunted by his crimes, that he kept them boxed. Another chilling detail involved his description of some victims begging for their lives. He acknowledged hearing pleas, he acknowledged ignoring them. He did not describe this with visible distress. This reveals a conscious override of empathy that he heard. He understood that he proceeded. Investigators also learned that Ridgway sometimes killed victims who had already paid him for sex. This underscores that money was not the primary motivator. Sex was not the primary motivator. Control was. The confessions also highlighted the scale of missed intervention. Ridgway admitted to assaults that did not result in death. He admitted to violent encounters reported by survivors. These incidents could have led to arrest if sufficient evidence had existed at the time, but evidence was thin. Patterns were fragmented. Systems were slow. Ridgway exploited this. When asked if he thought he would ever be caught, Ridgway said he did not, that he believed he had beaten the system. This belief sustained him. It allowed him to continue without fear. The confessions reveal a man who did not see himself as extraordinary. He did not claim genius. He did not claim destiny. He saw himself as someone who got away with things. That belief is perhaps the most chilling of all. It suggests that the line between hidden predator and exposed criminal is sometimes thinner than we want to believe. That Ridgway's confessions did not offer poetic insight. They did not offer philosophical reflection. They offered logistics, routes, locations, methods, numbers. This mechanical quality underscores a core truth. Evil does not always announce itself with grandiosity. Sometimes it speaks in monotone. Sometimes it uses simple words. Sometimes it sounds ordinary. The confession of a monster, in this case, did not sound monstrous, and that is what makes it so disturbing. Chapter 14. Faces of the Forgotten. When history remembers serial murder cases, it often remembers the name of the killer. The victims become footnotes, numbers, statistics. But behind every number is a face, a voice, a life that existed long before it intersected with violence. The women killed by Gary Ridgway were not born into tragedy. They were not destined to become victims. They were children once. They learned to walk. They learned to speak. They went to school. They laughed with friends. They imagined futures. Some dreamed of becoming mothers. Some dreamed of becoming artists. Some dreamed simply of being safe. Those dreams mattered. Even when they were interrupted by hardship. Even when addiction entered their lives. Even when choices became constrained by circumstances beyond their control. To speak of the faces of the forgotten is to resist the flattening effect of crime statistics. It is to insist on individuality. Many of Ridgway's victims grew up in unstable households. Some experienced abuse. Some ran away from home as teenagers. Some were drawn into street life by older individuals who exploited their vulnerability. These pathways are not excuses. They are contexts. Understanding context does not justify harm. It humanizes. It reminds us that vulnerability is often produced, not chosen. Some victims had children. These children grew up with unanswered questions. Some were raised by grandparents. Some entered foster care. Some spent years wondering why their mother never came back. The ripple effects of each murder extended far beyond one person. It reached into families, into communities, into future generations. When remains were finally identified years later, families were often confronted with a strange emotional collision: relief, grief, anger, sadness, all at once. Relief that uncertainty ended, grief that hope had been false, anger that justice came so late, sadness that time had stolen opportunities for goodbye. These emotional collisions are difficult to process. They do not resolve neatly. Some families held memorial services decades after disappearance. Some visited graves for the first time long after the person had died. Some chose private remembrance. Some spoke publicly. All of these responses are valid. The victims' faces, when seen in photographs from their childhoods, challenge stereotypes. They do not look like caricatures of street people. They look like children, teenagers, young women with hairstyles and clothing typical of their eras, smiling, standing with friends, posing awkwardly. Normal, ordinary, human. These images disrupt simplistic narratives. They force recognition. These were not abstract figures. They were individuals whose lives were cut short. It is also important to acknowledge that some victims remain unidentified. Despite advances in forensic science, some remains have not been matched to names. These unidentified victims represent an additional layer of tragedy. They exist in a liminal state, known to have existed, unknown in identity. Somewhere, there may still be families who do not know what happened to their loved ones. This uncertainty persists, even after conviction, even after confession. The faces of the forgotten are not only those who died. They include families who waited, friends who searched, children who grew up without answers. The emotional toll is immeasurable. Remembering victims does not require graphic detail. It requires recognition. It requires naming their humanity. It requires resisting the temptation to focus solely on the killer. The Green River case is often described in terms of scale, but scale should not eclipse individuality. 48 confirmed murders are not 48 identical tragedies. They are 48 unique lives. 48 unique stories. 48 sets of relationships. 48 futures erased. Some victims were described by families as gentle, some as stubborn, some as funny, some as protective of younger siblings, some as artists, some as animal lovers. These traits mattered. They still matter. The act of remembering is a form of resistance. It resists the reduction of human beings to crime scene evidence. It resists the erasure that predators rely on. Ridgway relied on anonymity. He relied on silence. He relied on invisibility. Remembering faces undermines that. It restores presence. It says, you existed. You were here. You are not just a number. This chapter is not about listing names. It is about acknowledging humanity, about shifting the center of gravity away from the perpetrator, about placing the women where they belong. At the center. Memory is not only about the past. It shapes the future. How a society remembers victims influences how it responds to vulnerability, how it designs protections, and how it measures whose lives matter. The women killed by Gary Ridgway were forgotten in life by many systems long before they were forgotten in death. That is one of the most painful truths of this case. Some of the victims had attempted to seek help. They entered treatment programs. They contacted family members. They tried to leave street life. Relapse and instability are often misunderstood as personal failures. In reality, they are common features of addiction and trauma. Recovery is rarely linear. Support systems must be sustained. Many victims did not have access to sustained support. When we speak of faces of the forgotten, we are also speaking about the face of systemic neglect. Neglect does not look like a single dramatic ACT to IT looks like underfunded mental health services to IT looks like long waiting lists for treatment.it. Looks like shelters at capacity.it looks like criminalization without rehabilitation.it looks like stigma. Ridgway exploited these conditions that he did not create them, but he recognized their existence, and he used them. The faces of the forgotten challenge us to examine these structures honestly, not to assign simplistic blame, but to ask difficult questions. What could have been different? What resources might have changed outcomes? What warning signs were missed? These questions do not change the past, but they can influence the future. Families of victims often become advocates. Some speak publicly about addiction awareness. Some push for better missing persons protocols. Some work with organizations that support vulnerable women. Their activism transforms grief into action. It ensures that loss is not the final word. In remembering the victims, it is also important to recognize their resilience. Survival in difficult circumstances requires strength, even when that strength is not recognized as such. Many of the women navigated violent environments long before encountering Ridgway. They developed coping strategies. They formed friendships. They protected one another in small ways. These acts matter. They demonstrate agency within constraint. The tendency to define people solely by their worst moments or hardest circumstances is a form of dehumanization that reduces complex lives to single labels. The faces of the forgotten resist that reduction. They insist on complexity. They insist on dignity. Another important aspect of remembrance is acknowledging that some victims remain unidentified. Advances in genetic genealogy and forensic databases continue to provide hope. New technologies may one day attach names to currently unknown remains. Each identification matters. It reconnects a person to a family. It restores lineage. It ends a long chapter of uncertainty. The Green River case also changed how many law enforcement agencies approach missing persons cases. Protocols have evolved. Databases are more integrated. There is greater awareness that marginalized individuals are at higher risk and deserve immediate attention. These changes are part of the victim's legacy, not in a way that glorifies suffering, but in a way that acknowledges impact. The faces of the forgotten are not only behind us, they are present in every person currently living on the margins, every runaway teenager, every person struggling with addiction, every individual without stable housing. These lives matter now. Remembering past victims should sharpen our attention to present vulnerability. The final tragedy of forgetting is repetition. When lessons are ignored, patterns return. Remembering is a form of prevention. It is a refusal to look away. It is a commitment to notice. Intervene. Care. The women killed by Gary Ridgway were not invisible. They were made invisible. There is a difference. Visibility is not inherent. It is granted or denied by systems that we can choose differently. That we can choose to see. That we can choose to listen. That we can choose to value. The faces of the forgotten are not asking to be sensationalized. They are asking to be acknowledged. That be remembered as human beings. That acknowledgement does not undo loss, but it honors existence. And sometimes, honoring existence is the most powerful act left. Chapter 15. Legacy of Horror and Lessons Unlearned. When a case as vast as the Green River murders finally reaches a legal conclusion, there is often an expectation of finality, ending. A sense that the story has closed. But some stories do not close. They linger, they echo, they become part of the cultural and institutional fabric. The legacy of Gary Ridgway is not confined to court records or prison walls. That IT exists in policies shaped by the case. IN investigative procedures were written because of IT.IN families who carry loss forward. IN communities that remember fear. Legacy is not only about what happened at IT, is about what changed. The Green River case fundamentally altered how law enforcement agencies view cold cases. It demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate analysis is impossible. It showed that advances in science can transform old failures into new successes. Evidence storage protocols were strengthened, DNA collection standards were expanded, interagency communication systems were improved. These are tangible outcomes. They save lives. But legacy is also about what did not change quickly enough. Many of the conditions that made Ridgway's crimes possible still exist in different forms. Addiction remains widespread. Mental health services remain underfunded in many regions. Affordable housing shortages persist. Stigma towards sex workers continues. These realities create vulnerability. Predators look for vulnerability. This is one of the most uncomfortable lessons of the case, that we can arrest a killer, that we can imprison him. But if underlying vulnerabilities remain unaddressed, the ecosystem that allowed him to operate still exists. That Ridgway's crimes forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about whose lives are prioritized. The slow response to early disappearances was not because investigators did not care. It was because systems are shaped by cultural values. Those values influence urgency. Changing systems requires changing values. That work is ongoing. Another part of the case's legacy lies in public understanding of what a serial killer looks like. Ridgway did not match popular stereotypes. That he was not charismatic. He was not flamboyant. He did not seek attention. That he was quiet, ordinary. This challenges the notion that danger is easily recognizable. The IT underscores the importance of focusing on behavior rather than appearance. Patterns of violence, reports of strangulation, repeated assaults. These are warning signs. Taking them seriously saves lives. The Green River case also highlights the importance of listening to survivors. Several women reported being choked by a man matching Ridgway's description. Those reports were fragments of truth, fragments that did not fully coalesce until decades later. Improving systems for connecting such reports across jurisdictions is a direct lesson from this case. Legacy is not only institutional. IT is personal. For families of victims, legacy means carrying memory forward. IT means telling stories. IT means ensuring that daughters, sisters, and mothers are remembered as more than crime scene references. This act of remembrance resists the killer's attempt to erase individuality. IT reclaims narrative. Another layer of legacy involves the emotional impact on investigators. Many detectives who worked the Green River case described it as the most difficult assignment of their careers. They carried images. They carried unanswered questions. They carried the weight of knowing that a killer remained free. For some, Ridgway's eventual arrest brought relief. For others, it brought mixed emotions. Why did it take so long? Could more have been done? These questions do not have simple answers, but they shape future practice. The legacy of horror is not just about what happened at IT, is about what must never be allowed to happen again. The final lesson of the Green River case is not found in court transcripts or forensic reports. IT is found in reflection. In the quiet question that lingers long after the headlines fade. What does this story ask of us? It does not ask us to memorize the killer's name. IT does not ask us to replay the details of his crimes. IT asks us to examine the spaces where suffering hides. The Green River murders exposed how easily certain lives can slip into invisibility when systems fail to protect them. They revealed how stigma can delay urgency. They demonstrated how vulnerability becomes a hunting ground when support structures collapse. These lessons are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Legacy is often framed as something that belongs to the past in reality, legacy shapes the present. The policies influenced by the Green River case continue to evolve. Cold case units now exist in many jurisdictions. DNA databases are more comprehensive. Missing persons cases are increasingly treated with greater seriousness, regardless of background. These are improvements, but improvement is not completion. The deeper lesson is about attention. Who do we notice? Who do we listen to? Who do we believe? Ridgway's victims were not believed quickly enough. Their danger was not treated urgently enough. That delay had consequences. Legacy also involves education. Understanding that predators often appear ordinary disrupts dangerous myths. That IT shifts focus toward patterns of behavior rather than surface impressions. Repeated strangulation assaults are not minor incidents. They are warnings. Reports from marginalized individuals are not unreliable. They are often the earliest signals. Listening saves lives. The Green River case also challenges us to think about prevention beyond policing. Law enforcement is reactive by design. IT responds after harm occurs. Prevention requires social investment, accessible addiction treatment, mental health services, safe housing, outreach programs. These are not abstract policy ideas. They are protective barriers. Every barrier reduces vulnerability. Every reduction in vulnerability shrinks the space predators can exploit. Another part of the case's legacy is the way it reshaped conversations about evidence preservation. The fact that biological samples collected decades earlier could eventually identify a killer is a testament to foresight. IT reminds us that even when justice seems impossible, preparation matters. Future tools may extract meaning from today's unanswered questions. This perspective encourages patience, not passive patience, active patience, the kind that preserves, documents, and revisits. The final lesson is about memory. Memory is an act of choice that we can choose to remember only the sensational aspects, or we can choose to remember the human cost. Choosing the latter honors the victims. IT centers compassion rather than fascination. The Green River case will always be associated with horror that cannot be undone, but horror does not have to be its only legacy. IT can also be associated with change, with awareness, with commitment to do better. The women who were killed cannot be brought back, but their stories can influence how we protect others. That influence is a form of meaning carved from tragedy, not redemption, not closure, but responsibility. The story does not end with Gary Ridgway sitting in a prison cell. IT continues in every decision made about how society treats its most vulnerable members. IT continues in every effort to notice someone who is struggling. IT continues in every choice to listen rather than dismiss. Legacy is not something that happens on its own. IT is built, moment by moment, choice by choice. The legacy of horror becomes a legacy of lessons only if those lessons are acted upon. That is the final truth this story leaves behind.